Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It's Thursday, February 14th, 2019. I'm Michael Brooks on a Michael Thursday. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We're broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On today's program, Professor Djene Bajalan of Missouri State University. We're talking about the looming threat as the Warsaw Conference on Iran continues. Bibi's talking about war with Iran as a crazed foreign ministries and prime ministers and leadership of Israel and the Gulf states make increasingly ominous noises. And Netanyahu takes credit for airstrikes in Syria. Europeans fighting to maintain the Iran deal as the U.S., Israeli, Emirati, Gulf, and Saudi axis seems to be pushing for global catastrophe. We'll talk about that with him, plus an update on Kurdistan, the leaders of the most promising political party in Turkey, political prisoners under Erdogan. We're talking about that with Professor Bajalan. Ilhan Omar is an absolute rock star. Let's go into some of the history of just what crimes Elliot Abrams was doing. And of course, we'll only be covering a fraction of them. There's a whole world to lay to waste with that absolute ghoul and the absolute ghouls that he represented. Then we'll talk about the less significant but also ghoulish chumps saying like, yeah, it's super rude to talk about supporting genocide. He's very nice in the coffee room. New York City wins. The Amazon scam is canceled. Organizing works, folks.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you. Many people are saying it. Good time as any to knock on some doors and make some contributions to Nomiki Konst, her great campaign for New York City public advocate, and her advocacy part of the effort against canceling that nonsense. The House passes a measure to stop U.S. support for the slaughter in Yemen. However, there is a significant caveat that was put in there that might dilute the effect of that legislation. Paul Manafort admits, oh, he lied. And Cuba suggests that U.S. is moving planes in a strategic fashion towards escalating even more as they continue to choreograph this attempted coup in Venezuela. Natural catastrophe in Zimbabwe as anti-austerity protests continue there, similar to the ones in the Sudan. Ruth Bader Ginsburg isn't looking to quit, but Judge Clarence Thomas, who should have been removed quite some time ago from the court, is considering doing just that. Potential new ludicrous charges against political prisoner Lula da Silva in Brazil as Brazilian defense forces move in and engage in indiscriminate killings in favelas. And NRA-style gun laws are unleashed on Brazil. All that and much, much more on today's Majority Report. So, folks, I want to say we all saw the incredible Ilhan Omar clip with Elliot Abrams. It's embargoed, and actually Sam did have a legit defense. He said, look, I've been hating Elliot Abrams since you were in diapers. And fair enough. We're going to, not only actually are we going to play the clip tomorrow, but there's actually going to be a good interview specifically on the just literally endless crimes and just complete inhumanity of the relentlessly grotesque Elliott Abrams and the relentless grotesqueness in U.S. foreign policy, defense, intellectual, and diplomatic establishments that he represents, as well as this just like bizarre toadying defense of a guy who, at the very least should be disgraced, if not in prison. So we'll get to that, but we're going to go in the second half on some of the specific histories of El Salvador and Guatemala. But we just want to sort of give you a teaser in this opening segment here, because first here's Ilhan Omar. And I just got to say, I did an analysis of it. People should check out at the Michael Brooks Show YouTube page on the freak out about her Israel statements. And, I think there's actually subtleties and nuances to get into here, including a critique of outrage culture, frankly, as well as also the fact that everybody can, improve. God's working on all of us, as these Sumeros say. But the bottom line is, on the substance of Israel as a policy question, she is 100% right in terms of the abuse of Palestinians. And she has also been a target of right-wing political terrorism, including from fellow members of Congress, and now, of course, the idiot, dope, bigot-in-chief president. The fact that she would have the chutzpah, and I will teach her that if she doesn't know that Yiddish word yet, the chutzpah to come out and just give this pure moral clarity and acuity in that exchange with the disgusting, grotesque Elliott Abrams. I mean, people should go hit her with a campaign contribution. I mean, this is just incredibly impressive leadership. Ilhan Omar is a hero. And I also enjoyed this because, look, she released the statement. It was actually a great statement. She pulled off an incredible synthesis of expressing sensitivity to where people had felt she had gone wrong and also reaffirming her commitment to working on the underlying issue, which she's 100% right about with regards to democracy for all in the Middle East. CNN is still trying to make an issue of it, and she was confronted walking the halls of Congress by Manu Raju, and instead of saying like, hey, have you always cared so passionately about the genocide in Guatemala, which Elliott Abrams supported, the cover-ups of the mass rapes and beheadings of toddlers in El Salvador, which he supported and covered up? How was it? How about the blowback from a bunch of people who apparently think, having coffee in a think tank boardroom is more important than genocide? What about that? No, they go back to this already dead story that the political right is trying to make hay of, and she shows that AOC is not the only one that knows how to handle public nuisances.
Our own Manu Raju found her quite unwilling to discuss the controversy
when
he asked her about it.
Just as always, Jake Tapper, shut up.
Jake Tapper on brand here, pestering a Muslim.
Pestering a Muslim with his concern, like this piety nonsense of Jake Tapper. Just shut up. All right, go ahead.
Discuss the controversy when he asked her about it today.
The president track record here. What's wrong with you? Well, I'm asking you a question about your tweet. You had a tweet saying the president trafficked in hate.
Yes, I tweeted. There's a response. You can run that. Have a nice day.
They leave out the critical part where he's asking her about Trump's tweet in response to her response.
What about your tweet, though?
What about your tweet to my tweet? What about... That's
no,
right.
Not your original tweet. What about your reply tweet?
What about your reply tweet, which got ratioed? Actually, it didn't at all get ratioed. It won, but great crack reporting. Instead of, go back and read Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky. There's no doubt that the corporate press has, of course, always been, kowtowed to the U.S. foreign policy establishment, but like. We're still going to play a throwback clip of the 1980s of Peter Jennings talking about the mass murder that the Reagan administration backed in El Salvador. And in 2019, CNN is like, you know what? Don't even worry about the Guatemala genocide stuff. Let's go try to talk about her Twitter drama with Trump. Pathetic.
Speaking, you said give money to Ilhan.
Yes, indeed.
Jesse Kelly here, if you want to put that up, Brendan. who's apparently, I think, a Republican. What does he say here? The Jesse Kelly
He's
show.
the kid. He's the guy who was really upset that his kid was doing a robotics competition. He was talking about getting drunk all weekend. Embarrassed by his son who does robotics competition.
My son's a nerd.
So Jesse says Republicans should be pouring money into Ilhan Omar's re-election campaign. If you're a Republican and you wanted to plant a destructive parasite, I mean, that's some interesting language there.
That's I was going to say, that's an interesting, and actually if you think of, well, this doesn't apply because she's Muslim, she's not Arab, but if we expanded Semite to include Arabs at least, the phrase parasite in relation to any Semitic people, I'm going to say pretty strong.
Not good.
Not skillful.
What exactly would you be doing differently than what she's doing? It's glorious. I'm donating. Please, Republicans, please donate to Ilhan Omar.
You are totally right. Actually, as a matter of fact,
You're owning the libs.
Yes. Every time a Republican donates money to Ilhan Omar, a transgender equal civil rights bathroom is closed or something. I don't know. We cry liberal tears. Don't do it.
Yeah,
oh, no. Please, Republicans, don't send money to Ilhan Omar.
Or a unisex bathroom will be segregated again.
Yeah. Oh, no. Please don't. I guess it probably is pretty easy to do reverse psychology in these idiots. But no, I mean, don't listen to Jesse Kelly. Oh, no. If you're a Republican, don't contribute money to Ilhan Omar. Okay. And I just want a couple, as I say, foreshadowing, because we're going to go more into depth in terms of Guatemala and El Salvador, and then tomorrow with Elliot Abrams. I mean, there's a whole world to lay to waste with this guy, and all obviously U.S. foreign policy that he represents. I've kind of had a soft spot for Kilmeade recently, and I mean, just in the sense that occasionally he seems to not, he's sort of been caught up to like 2002 in terms of like overt racism.
And he can have instinctively human responses, which are normally conditioned out of Fox News.
Right, which you'll never see from a Ducey. But I just want to, I mean, look, it's Fox and Friends. They're stupid. They're immoral. They don't know anything. I just want, as a foreshadowing, just to be really clear, when we talk about like what the Reagan administration backed in El Salvador in the 80s as an example, we're not talking about, like, I don't know what they mean. Maybe it's almost like you're trying to conjure almost like a Singapore image. Like, oh, like Lee Kuan Yew had to arrest. And by the way, this is wrong too. But you're conjuring an image of like, oh, well, you put some people in jail. You shut down some newspapers, which, by the way, should be unacceptable in and of itself. But just to be really clear here, there are documented cases of El Salvadoran soldiers going into a family's home, beheading everybody, and then doing it around a table so that the heads are reattached to the body with oh no hands on their faces and a bowl of blood in the middle of the table. I mean, you're talking about the types of things that honestly, I mean, I guess if you were looking, some persons have said ISIS would be similar. That's true. And then some stuff that you would see in the cartel wars was the governments that the Reagan administration was not only financially and politically, but like morally backing, like greeting in the White House. And there were endless contemporaneous reports of what was happening. And Elliot Abrams was going, I don't see that as, I don't think that's true. So just to be clear here, as we laugh at the, in this case, as dumb as he is, just totally immoral, Brian Kilmeade, keep that in mind.
She's accusing him of being a liar and wanted to know about the Iran-Contra affair.
He is a liar.
Well, she was, listen, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in that region, Bolivia, there was a communist infiltration in the 1980s, and President Reagan wasn't going to have it. He was going to make sure that the Russians and then the Soviets were not going to infiltrate and take over our hemisphere. So to do that, you had to do some extreme work. He's part of that work, and the efforts of that gave us El Salvador, which is closer to a democracy than not, right. And Central and South America are the president should be very proud of his foreign policy. For this refreshment congresswoman to be that dismissive and condescending to someone like Elliot Abrams is beyond the pale. Democrats should all be embarrassed.
Yeah, we should really be embarrassed. First of all, he was a liar. He was literally pardoned for his role in Iran-Contra. That's on the public record. I know obviously there's no research staff there. And then, I mean, again, extreme work, as he sounds like the general character in Doctor Strangelove.
That is an amazing on-the-fly euphemism. Like,
I mean,
very revealing.
Orwellian's overused, but what other word could you use to describe that? I mean, I thought Collateral Damage was a cynical evasion of a profoundly ugly truth. Extreme work? I mean, what is this, like a new, like Kilmeade's new regimen at the Equinox? I mean, wow. Beyond disgusting. All right, we're going to take a little bit of a break, and we will be right back with Djene Bajalan. If you're listening on podcast, you had a very good interstitial there. Joining us now is Djene Bajalan. He's a professor at Missouri State University. He's also a regular on TMBS. Djene, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Great to have you on. So the war drums coming out of Warsaw are extraordinarily disturbing. I mean, we'll get into the particulars of the implications of pulling out of the Iran deal, the various regional dynamics at play. But the rhetoric, particularly from Netanyahu, literally using the word war, should make everybody obviously not only profoundly concerned, but get to organizing against the catastrophe that apparently he and Pompeo and the Gulf states are pushing. I want to also just start us off here by saying that Benjamin Netanyahu has a pretty long history of talking about military interventions in the Middle East spearheaded by the United States that will work out quite well in his estimation. This is a clip from 2002 where Benjamin Netanyahu, in testimony before the U.S. Congress, suggests that not only, and this is really important, not only that invading Iraq will be great, but that invading Iraq is the only path to peace in the Middle East. And Mike Pompeo said this just yesterday with regards to Iran. This is Bibi Netanyahu in 2002.
If you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region. And I think that people sitting right next door in Iran, young people, and many others will say, the time of such regimes, of such despots, is gone. There is a new age. Something new is happening.
And that is speculation on your part, or you have some evidence to that effect?
I was asked the same question in 1986. I had written a book in which I had said that the way to deal with terrorist regimes, well, with terror, was to deal with the terrorist regimes. And the way to deal with the terrorist regimes, among other things, was to apply military force against them.
The way we did in Afghanistan.
The way, for example, I want to answer your question.
Well, I guess I'm running out of time, so I quickly was trying to get there. We've done, I think, what you proposed in Afghanistan, yet I haven't seen that sort of neighborhood effect.
Well, I think there's been an enormous effect. The effect was, we were told that there would be a contrary effect. First of all, people said that there would be tens of thousands of people streaming into Afghanistan, zealots who would be outraged by America's action, and this would produce a counter-reaction in the Arab world.
But I think you're now saying that when you take an action like we did in Afghanistan, we're going to see all the other countries just fold.
No, what we saw is something else. First of all, we saw everybody streaming out of Afghanistan. The second thing we saw is all the Arab countries and many Muslim countries trying to side with America, trying to be okay with America. The application of power is the most important thing in winning the war on terrorism. If I had to say, what are the three principles of winning the war on terror? It's like, what are the three principles of real estate, the three L's, location, location, location? The three principles of winning the war on terror are the three W's, winning, winning, and winning. The more victories you amass, the easier the next victory becomes. The first victory in Afghanistan makes the second victory in Iraq that much easier. The second victory in Iraq will make the third victory that much easier too, but it may change the nature of achieving that victory. It may be possible to have implosions taking place. I don't guarantee it, Mr. Turney, but I think it makes it more likely, and therefore I think the choice of Iraq is a good.
Okay, so in addition to the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is some form of neo-fascist, not being news to anybody with this 2002 clip, just spell out all the ways in which he was so arrogantly and catastrophically wrong there.
Well, I think you can look at that statement within the context of, judging the Iraq invasion on the metrics that people like Bibi Netanyahu and people in the Bush administration put up for them. And it's been a failure even in their terms. So, for example, we're going to be talking about Iran and the growing influence of Iran. Well, if we look at what the Iraq invasion did, it's enhanced the Iranian position in Iraq to sort of a massive degree. Now you have sort of a pro-Iranian government in Baghdad. That's not to say the Iraqi government is a tool of Iran, but Iranian influence in Iraq has increased since the Iraqi invasion. So even by their own metrics, it's really hard to argue that the Iraq war was a success. Today, Iranian-backed militias are, the popular mobilization units are part of the Iraqi administration. And in fact, Iran and the United States, even under Trump, have been cooperating in the fight against ISIS in Iraq. So, even judged by sort of what Bibi Netanyahu was obviously pushing at.
But broaden it out. I mean, that's true, but broaden it out for just the broader humanitarian security. I mean, this is just because, again, it would have been wrong thing to do even if it was a quote-unquote success. So, yes, it failed even by their own metrics, but this was massively catastrophic and, well beyond a sort of natural relationship between Iraq and Iran.
Well, what we've seen basically is, Al-Qaeda today are kind of forgotten. We all think about ISIS, but if you remember 10, 15 years ago, Al-Qaeda was apparently the scariest thing on the block. But, we ended up with something worse, and that's ISIS, which is metastasized within the context of state collapse in Iraq, a complete failure after the invasion, and an invasion that was ill-conceived in the first place, which didn't really, there was insufficient planning, and just looking at just the moral case for the war, it was completely unprovoked. So on an international basis, it was an example of the United States taking this preemptive action. So it's and of course the humanitarian cost for the people of Iraq and in the neighboring region has been enormous. We had mass ethnic cleansing in Iraq. There was basically a civil war taking place. Hundreds of thousands have been killed, and it's very hard to argue that on any level that this has been a success. And the notion that this opened the way for sort of the spread of democracy in the Middle East seems a little bit absurd to me. I mean, we can't do counterfactuals. We can't go back in time and sort of check what would have happened had the United States not invaded Iraq. But, maybe the Arab Spring would have had different results. Maybe the whole discourse of democracy would have been more powerful in the Middle East. Remember, these invasions were made often in the name of promoting democracy. The Iraq War was made in the name of promoting democracy. So that, of course, leads to a great deal of suspicion in people in the Middle East regarding, democracy and the West's commitment to democracy, and sort of when Western leaders sort of claim to care about these issues, people are very cynical about it. So, people are looking at Venezuela today and seeing that as almost a repeat of what was being done in Iraq, a decade and a half ago.
Right down to the U.S. manufactured opposition. Do you think that? Let's get to Iran. So first of all, will you spell out for us again that another part of this whole crisis is again the purely, Iraq was purely manufactured and lied about and hyped because Iraq simply posed no threat. It was just the notion it posed any kind of strategic systemic threat was ludicrous. In the Iran case, of course, and again, look, I don't really, in some ways, I just want to kind of put out, let's just, get these other things out of the way really quickly. One, of course, does the Iranian regime have internally repressive policies, and is there a huge amount of discontent inside Iran, not only in terms of human rights, as we typically talk about here, but also, which are very important, but also labor union suppression. There's a big amount of inequality, corruption. There's big problems inside Iran, and as with Iraq or Venezuela, for that matter, opposing interventions, imperialism, and war does not require spinning the performance of the government in place. Now, that being said, and then there's other areas where we have synchronized interests with Iran, or in fact maybe we have a strong disagreement, but Iran might have a point. Other areas where Iran's role is destructive, just like any other place. But clearly, Trump. The United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia are obviously in no position to talk to anybody about human rights. And more importantly than any kind of hypocrisy point, you had this incredibly effective and successful Iran nuclear deal that was working. And that's why the Europeans are still trying to preserve it. So can you walk us through the deal, the success of it, and how that's playing out in the context of this just entirely fake manufactured crisis?
Yeah, so if we go back to looking at the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, it was it set up mechanisms through which Iran's nuclear program could be verified, and it was signed by the major players, the major world powers, which includes the European Union, Russia, and China. So it was never purely a deal between the United States and Iran. It was a deal between a coalition, which the Obama administration had managed to weld together, which was no simple task. And that coalition was sort of successful in dealing with the issue of, first of all, compartmentalizing the issue of Iran's nuclear deal. There are a lot of other areas of conflict between, for example, Europe and the United States and Iran, but by compartmentalizing this particularly destabilizing issue and coming up with a mechanism which both sides could agree to. So in 2015, you have this nuclear deal being signed, you have it implemented, you have verification. And you saw a couple of weeks ago, the head of the CIA said that Iran is still technically complying with the agreement. Yep. The European Union is still trying to keep the agreement alive as well. So there's still a commitment on behalf of the other signatories to the Iran nuclear deal of keeping this agreement alive. But it was always an agreement restricted to Iran's nuclear deal. It was not billed as being a resolution to all problems between the United States and Iran. And it, as a diplomatic measure, one could see it was, it could have perhaps acted as building trust between the two sides and perhaps laying the foundation for a broader rapprochement. But what we saw last year was sort of the Trump administration sort of unilaterally withdrawing from that agreement. And that was particularly dangerous on a number of levels. Firstly, in terms of, again, their own stated goals of trying to sort of bring Iran under control, it removes an important sort of leverage the United States has over Iran. Now Iran enjoys the moral high ground as they remain committed to the agreement, and the United States is kind of the group that has reneged on it. It undermines broader confidence in American diplomatic activity because, of course, if you make an agreement with one administration, why would the next administration necessarily stick to that deal? So that has implications not just for the Middle East, but in other parts of the world. In places like North Korea, where we desperately do need a diplomatic resolution to this crisis on the Korean Peninsula. But again, how are we going to make a plausible? How are people, leaders in the West, even let's say in 2020 you get a better president, if they come to power, how can a country signing an agreement with the United States be sure that that agreement will be sort of maintained by the next administration? And that's enormously destabilizing, not just for American prestige, but for stability in the world, because if the world's dominant power can't be trusted to keep to an agreement, that's, obviously not something that we that's necessarily going to be positive for global affairs. So, the chance of resolving further issues between Western powers and Iran have been diminished by this. And, we still see major, like as you mentioned, and as I just mentioned, there are areas where the Iranian government and the Western powers have sort of strategic agreement, strategic alignment, and Iraq is one of those places. But there are, of course, other regions where, it's much more conflictual, and that's, of course, Yemen, where there's a clash in interest, and of course Syria, which has become basically a battlefield for various factions in a very complicated and very convoluted sort of balance of power and sort of conflicts in the Middle East, which, unlike in the Cold War, there's no nice and easy, steady lines between the two sides as well. So we have a very complicated proxy war taking place in Syria, in which Iran is a huge player. And, by leaving the Iran nuclear deal, it just makes sort of a general resolution to these issues a lot more difficult.
So, and guys, can we get this clip up of Netanyahu talking about war? I think it is on the list. But we have this meeting in Warsaw taking place, and it is interesting. I mean, there's a lot of hype about supposed differences between the Europeans and Trump, and clearly, obviously, people like Macron and Angela Merkel are on a different, different page than Donald Trump or Benjamin Netanyahu, for that matter, in terms of wanting a different, preserving the basically kind of post World War II order with its own obvious sets of huge, massive problems, inequities, abuses, and contradictions. That's different than this sort of reordering of global institutions. I wouldn't call it necessarily nationalism. I actually think all of this resurgent far-right forces are quite globally oriented, as evidenced by even this. But, they're not at this conference. But you do see certainly Gulf foreign ministers, and so that this kind of alliance that everybody's known about between Israel and the Gulf is kind of coming out more overtly here. And the Europeans are sending low-level officials and have a kind of problem with the fundamental premise of what certainly looks like a push for war conference. And I want to play. This was Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday in Warsaw. My understanding is they've since tried to kind of on different clips they're releasing now, they've put a different English translation but the word in Hebrew means war. Let's look at Netanyahu from yesterday.
מכאן אני הולך למפגש עם 60 שרי חוץ ונציגים של מדינות בעולם נגד איראן. מה שחשוב זה מפגש,
we obviously need one with English subtitles. Okay. The bottom line is, maybe we'll get to one later, but Benjamin Netanyahu talked about moving the world together, including Arab states, and the word he used was war with Iran. I mean, that's horrifying. That's obviously a game-changing global catastrophe if they actually go forward with this. Mike Pompeo's there saying that no peace in the Middle East. Vice President Pence is there trying to chastise the Europeans for trying to save the Iran deal achievement. How scared should we be?
Well, it does have a very sort of retro feeling. If you remember the coalition of the willing just before the Iraq War, you see the United States trying to weld together an alliance in the face of opposition from, some of its main allies in Europe. The reason the conference is taking place in Poland is because, Poland has a right-wing government that is sort of very is close to Trump ideologically, but also kind of wants to be in Trump's good books because they fear Russian aggression. They fear, Trump's relationship with Russia. I think they've even asked for a new military base to be built in Poland, and they promised to call it Camp Trump, trying to appeal to him. But
that sounds like an amazing idea.
Well, I'm sure it's probably the best strategy if you want a new military base in your country. Right. So this Warsaw meeting was sort of announced in the Cairo speech Mike Pompeo gave last month. And, it was initially supposed to be this meeting on Iran, although since then there's been sort of an expansion. You have, talk about the Israeli-Palestinian Jared's peace plan coming out. There's going to be discussions on Syria, discussions on Yemen. And, Pompeo is touting the fact that some 60 nations from all the continents in the world are there. Of course, many of the major players aren't there. We have Israel, Saudi Arabia, the U.S., the Gulf countries there like Oman and the UAE. But we don't have we don't have the EU top diplomat. The Lebanese aren't there. The Palestinians are there. Jeremy Hunt, the British foreign minister, is there, but he's only there to talk about Yemen. So sort of this Warsaw was an attempt to sort of build this coalition against Iran, but to get, to stop it from sort of falling through in its entirety, I think they've agreed, the Americans agreed to put a few more topics on the agenda. So now we have, Bibi's statements about war with Iran. Now, I'm not an expert in the Hebrew language, whether this was a mistranslation or
to be clear, Djene, I mean, the first, most people I've looked at have who know this well have definitely said that is the correct translation. But I think the most clarifying is that, if I recall correctly, the first tweet out of this was from the official prime ministerial account of Israel, and that was their translation.
Yes, I think there's been some sort of press about this. I was reading and reading different accounts, but I think we can miss the forest for the trees, because of course the fact is that in such a tense circumstances as we have existing between Israel and Iran, any slight slip of the tongue, even if it's intended or it's unintended, is an extremely dangerous thing. It just shows how, the fact that these words reverberated around the world so quickly sort of demonstrate, how tense relations are. And if we look over the last year and a half, there have been several clashes between the Iranians and the Israelis in Syria. And these weren't clashes between proxy groups. You have a Iranian drone going towards the Israelis. Israeli attacks back on sort of in Syrian air defenses and Iranian bases in early 2018. And, the Russians had to intervene to de-escalate that conflict. Again, when Trump withdrew from the Iran deal in May, this was almost immediately followed by Iranian rockets and Israeli strikes in Syria. So we've been seeing this escalation and ongoing sort of conflict between the Israelis and the Iranians. There's limits to it. This is not an all-out war, but this is definitely a conflict that's taking place, and there are military forces involved. So
let's actually play that clip. We have it because there's another part of it that I want to ask you about. This is with translation of Netanyahu from yesterday. We just came from an excellent meeting with Oman's minister responsible for foreign affairs. That's what he's saying. We discussed additional steps we can take together with countries of the region in order to advance common interests. That will continue. From here, I'm going to a meeting with 60 foreign ministers of envoys from countries around the world against Iran. What is important about this meeting is not in secret, because there are many of those, is that there's an open meeting with representatives of leading Arab countries, and they're sitting down together with Israel in order to advance the common interest of war with Iran. All right. To me, I will editorialize. I think we should be enormously concerned by this, and I think the push is rather obvious coming out of these three centers, the U.S., Israeli, and the Gulf. But the thing that I'm confused about there is my understanding from the Obama process that led to the Iran deal was that actually Oman was an interlocutor and helped pave the way for that deal. So I'm surprised, unless, of course, Netanyahu could just be misrepresenting what he and the Omanis talked, the tone of the Omanis. But is there a shift in Oman here?
Well, Oman has a long history of complicated relations with Iran. The Shah, for example, sent troops to Oman in the 70s to help the Omani monarchy against left-wing insurgents. And of course, there are religious ties between Oman and Iran. Oman is it's a different sect of Shiism, but it's a Shia-dominated country. So there are connections. So yes, Oman has sort of had better relations with Iran over the years, but I think what we're seeing in the Gulf is a consolidation of, we have the main power, Saudi Arabia, having an increasingly hostile stance towards Iran. So, that's forcing other Gulf countries, smaller Gulf countries, to, have to make a choice between, what they're going to do. I mean, the Saudis are more than willing to intervene in their neighbors. It's not only in Yemen that the Saudis are intervening, but we've seen them, intervene in other parts of the Gulf as well, militarily, as well as around the region, with their money and their support and so on and so forth. We've seen them bullying the Lebanese prime minister. They basically abducted him. So, people are playing for keeps in the Middle East. And so I think what we're seeing is, coalitions forming. And I agree with you. This kind of language is extremely destabilizing to the region. With we have violence taking place. I mean, I believe in January the Israelis were striking Iranian forces in Syria, and I'm sure we don't hear on the sort of public news all the operations that are taking place. And we can add to this. Saudi Arabia, of course, is increasingly concerned about the growth of Iranian power. Historically, Saudi Arabia supported a strong Iraqi regime. They supported Saddam Hussein during the 1980s as a bulwark against Iranian expansion. But now Iraq is basically a far more, friendly country to the Iranians. So, Saudi Arabia is looking for strong allies in this front as well. This rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel is sort of born out of a mutual dislike and antagonism towards Iran. And, nobody knows how far this is going to escalate. As we've seen, it can escalate to a disastrous level. Even if we don't see an all-out war with Iran, it looks like the American government and perhaps also the Israelis and the Saudis are attempting to, force the Iranian regime to at least implode. And what's dangerous about that is that we might end up with a Syria-like situation in Iran, which is going to be even more devastating and destabilizing for the region. Syria has been an enormously destabilizing factor, not only in the Middle East, but in Europe, with these huge waves of refugees and the ability of politically right-wing forces in Europe to sort of mobilize those things. So a war with Iran and, perhaps a fresh wave of refugees, of Iranians fleeing the country could be further destabilizing. So, this just
humanitarianly catastrophic. I just want to say really quickly too, because we'll pivot the last couple of minutes to Kurdistan and Kurdish political prisoners in Turkey that we've written about. But I think that it's very important, especially if you just look at Netanyahu specifically. Netanyahu has used Iraq and Iran have always been his main framing devices for supporting the unending occupation of Palestine and the lack of Palestinian rights and, all of the abuses in Gaza and so on. And, it's both in some ways, it's such a lazy framing device and a sort of endless excuse that one almost wonders if they would even want to get rid of Iran as a reason for, because that's the kind of always the fallback. And again, this is not just, critics like me. I mean, people like in the Israeli security establishment, Ehud Olmert, as an example, have called out the delusional fear-mongering about Iran and have kind of acknowledged that it's a distraction from Israel, having an apartheid state. But I think, I will say that very specifically when you correlate the language of that 2002 clip on Iraq and you look at Mike Pompeo, who is also, an extraordinarily dangerous and extremist figure in foreign policy making, I think that we need to. I think you're right, and I'm not a doomsday person, and as horrifying and as catastrophic and as terrible and as disastrous as this administration will always be, there was some catastrophe scenarios that I didn't really see in the same way, or even things like the Russia thing doesn't cause me, various conniptions it seems to cause people. But I've always thought that there is a serious contingent here in that far right axis emanating from, the Emiratis to Tel Aviv to DC that might want to do something incredibly reckless and dangerous here with Iran. And I just think we need to be, incredibly focused on this and aware of it, because it could not be more dangerous in either of the scenarios that you outlined. And by the way, including even just this present scenario.
Well, let me just add one thing to that.
Sure.
I mean, I think a key figure that we have to mention is John Bolton. And,
yes.
The fact that, I think last week Bolton was caught having on his pad that he was moving troops to Venezuela. He's a well-known war hawk.
Yep.
It's not so long ago, 2015, that he was, writing op-eds calling on the United States to bomb Iran. Earlier this year, there were reports that, there were plans drawn up to strike Iran. So, even if we're not going to see this full-scale invasion, strikes on Iran are going to bring about a response. And Iran, one of the key areas of difference between Iran and the West is over Iran's ballistic missile program. Mm-hmm. And Iran, in 2017 was able to fire missiles from its territory to hit rebel targets in Syria. So, Iran has a growing missile capability. So it's not as if, Iran is incapable of striking back. These things could get out of hand before people even realize that they've gotten out of hand.
Right. Let's touch briefly about a couple things with Kurdistan before you go. First of all, you and I did coverage several weeks ago when the first pullout plan from Syria was announced. And, just renewing, I support pulling most forces out, but I do not want to sell out the Syrian Kurds to Turkey. And I look at politics through the prism of power. And as I've said a million times, even as I'm a robust critic of Russian and Chinese, zones of influence and abuses, just as I am, of course, of the United States. But if Russia was able to play a role in Venezuela that helped stop a coup process there, that would be great. And if U.S. forces are supporting, of course, not for the right reasons. I think we can move beyond those kind of childish conversations. But because of strategic calculation, first of all, a very noble and important political experiment and an expression of people who have been long repressed internally in the Middle East, as well as blocking a Turkish ethnic cleansing campaign, then I certainly support maintaining those troop levels. And I know you're on the same page with me. Where are we at with that first? What's the state?
Well, I might first begin by saying there is a kind of through line to this with this issue with Israel and Iran at the moment. One of the reasons things are sort of becoming more tense between Israel and Iran is the U.S. is withdrawing from Syria, and the Israelis are very concerned that this will be a victory for the Iranians. So that's a kind of side point in how these things all link together. But in general, we had the announcement towards the end of December by Trump, sort of surprising everybody that there was an agreement to withdraw troops. This made Turkey very happy, and it was also announced at the same time as a military deal with the Turks for the Patriot missile system and for some fighter jets as well. So what it looked like at the end of December was sort of a replay of what had happened in the 1970s. The United States had backed Kurdish guerrillas, but as soon as they managed to sort of sort out their bigger issues, the Kurds were dumped and sort of left to the hands of their enemies, in that case, the Iraqis. And this time it looked as if, the Americans were about to declare victory over ISIS, pack up and go home and leave the Syrian Kurds at the tender mercies of the Turkish military. And, just as the Americans were announcing they were leaving, you had Turkish officials promising that the Kurds in Syria would be sort of unceremoniously executed and dumped in ditches and buried in their ditches. So very inflammatory language. And apparently that's one of the reasons that General Mattis sort of resigned, was, he was kind of felt, he was being made a fool of because, he'd promised these people one thing and now they were going to be left to the mercy of the Turks. Now, what has happened since then has been utter confusion. So we've had the sort of it's painfully obvious that ISIS hasn't been defeated. As Trump was making the announcement, there was still fighting going on. There's still fighting taking place, but certainly we are coming to the end phase of the ISIS campaign, or at least defeating the territorial caliphate. So we're beginning to talk about what are we going to do with all these foreign fighters? What are the Syrian Kurds going to do? Are they going to send them back to America or to Britain or France, wherever they come from, and so on and so forth. So that conflict is certainly coming to an end, but there doesn't seem to be any appetite amongst the military to be withdrawing so quickly, especially with the idea that ISIS could reemerge. You have the sort of more hawkish elements within the foreign policy establishment. You have people like Bolton and Pompeo who seem to be trying to navigate between making Turkey happy, who wants a U.S. withdrawal and wants to be able to move in to Syria to force the Syrian Kurds out of the areas that they control, because, of course, Turkey regards the Syrian Kurdish forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces and the YPG, as being an extension of the PKK, which is the insurgency organization that is operating within Turkey. Now, what's happened now is we have America saying, on one hand, it's going to defend the Kurds, and in a tweet, Trump even threatened economic war with Turkey if they attack the Kurds. But at the same time, the United States is offering Turkey a safe zone, saying that, okay, you can have some kind of safe deployment zone. Now, this makes no sense, because if you know the geography of Syria, you will know most of the Syrian Kurdish areas are within 10, 20 kilometers of the Turkish border. So the creation of a Turkish dominated safe zone would mean almost the entire occupation of the Kurdish areas of Syria. So we have these sort of two different tracks taking place. Bolton, for example, traveled to Ankara, and apparently his promise to protect the Syrian Kurds enraged Erdogan so much that he refused to meet with him. Then you had Lindsey Graham, who has been critical of Turkey, sort of going to Turkey and talking with the Turkish government. And you sort of have this weird position where America says, okay, we recognize the PKK are terrorists, but the YPG and the Syrian Kurds aren't terrorists, they aren't the PKK, when, there is certainly a crossover between PKK membership and YPG membership. So there's a kind of willful self-delusion. So again, nobody knows what's going on. There were senior Syrian Kurdish officials came to Washington. Ilham Ahmed, who was representing the Syrian Kurds, spoke to Trump, and Trump apparently said that he loved the Kurds. So nobody knows what's going on. People on the ground are very skeptical now that the U.S. will withdraw, and more so since Congress has acted. Recently, there was a bipartisan resolution put forward by Marsha Blackburn and Tammy Duckworth, calling on Trump to sort of prevent a war between Turkey and the Syrian Kurds, because the Syrian Kurds have fought alongside the U.S. Against the Islamic State. And on a side note, the reason Marsha Blackburn is perhaps most interested in that is because Nashville, Tennessee is home to the largest Kurdish community in North America. So there's a kind of bit of local politics involved.
Well, so Marsha Blackburn, one of the worst people in Congress, who is mainly there to help people's student loans destroy their lives and defend home state HMOs. I guess at least credit due. There's a little bit of her constituent services are finally benefiting a worthy group. Literally 2 minutes left, but I do want to talk about this. You and I wrote a piece for the Jacobin a couple of weeks ago where we talked about the leadership of the HDP, which is a democratic, in fact, social democratic party in Turkey. They've been imprisoned by Erdogan as what has always been an authoritarian leaning leader has just, he's fully emerged. And in some ways you can understand Erdogan, I guess, along with Putin would be an early, these are the kind of early prototypes of the far right authoritarians, the Trumps, the Modis, the Bolsonaros, the Orbans, the Dutertes that we see across the globe. And so, we would oppose and speak out for as many people who've been imprisoned as possible, of course. And I speak a lot about Lula. But there is something. The reason we wrote this piece is not only is the imprisonment of these leaders of the HDP completely, comically unjustified and abusive in and of itself, they actually represent a political tendency which is not only an enormous promise for Turkey, but actually holds a different key to politics potentially in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the latest with that, of course, the imprisonment still is still going on, and in fact,
and who are the names? I forgot. Like, who are the names of these guys? Yeah,
the leaders, Saladin Demirtas and Figen Yüksekdağ, who are the co-leaders of the HDP. The HDP is a political party and organization in which the major executive positions are split into co-leaders, which can either be a man and a woman or two women. So it's a way of kind of ensuring women have a greater role in politics, which is remarkably progressive in the Middle Eastern context. And what's sort of singles it out in terms of women's rights and the women's issue, many reforms that are orientated towards liberating women are top down, into forcing people to take off their headscarves and so on and so forth. But this is actually a bottom up sort of form of women's liberation in which women are actually participating and are not being given rights from the top down. But I stray from the point there, in that, yes, we're continuing to see a persecution of the HDP in Turkey at the moment. Local elections are coming up very soon in Turkey, next month. So Erdogan is obviously trying to harden up his nationalist base. His tough rhetoric against the Kurds in Syria is part of it, and his tough rhetoric against the Kurds inside Turkey, or Kurdish political parties inside Turkey, are part of this. So we're seeing basically Erdogan recently made a statement saying there's no difference between the HDP, the PKK, the YPG. They're all part of the same network. And, we're seeing ongoing imprisonment of HDP officials from the level of parliamentary deputy right down to local government officials. Now, of course, there are protests taking place. For example, Leyla Güven, who is a HDP deputy, is on hunger strike, and she's protesting the continued isolation of the PKK's leader, Abdullah Öcalan. And the reason for doing this is that, in the past, the Justice and Development Party, Erdogan's political party, had been engaged in a peace process with the PKK. At the end of the day, you need to make peace with the parties that you're fighting with. And this has come to an end. So her protest is some people are trying to paint it as being very much part of this Abdullah Öcalan cult of personality, this being pro-PKK, but rather it's kind of call for the two sides to get back together and restart these peace talks as well. So protests are continuing, but the suppression of the parliamentary wing of this social democratic movement, which brings together Kurds, LGBT people, environmentalists, labor activists, left-wing activists, all these groups together, this repression is particularly strong. And Erdogan, as a prototype of one of these right-wing authoritarian leaders, one has to not underestimate him. He is a very successful leader who has a very good, feeling for Turkish politics, who's managed control, very well in the country. But at the same time, we're beginning to see conflicts taking place in Turkey. Turkey is also suffering from mismanagement because of the increasingly authoritarian nature of the Erdogan government. We have massive inflation taking place in Turkey. Inflation has been a perennial problem in Turkey, but in recent years it has been kind of kept under control. But growing conflict between, Turkey's growing conflict in the region, Turkey's increasingly problematic relations with the West are all beginning to take their toll on the Turkish economy. So nationalism, of course, is always a good way of deflecting against these problems. Erdogan recently made a speech and told people to stop complaining about the price of staples and start worrying about how much bullets cost and how much soldiers' uniforms cost, because Turkey is under threat. So Turkey has this very strange
and also
position.
Terrorizing a bad Knicks center too.
Is he a bad center?
He's not great, but there are bigger concerns. and protecting him. Dennis Cantor. Djene Bajalan, I really appreciate your time as always. Professor at Missouri State University. You can obviously find Djene's work so far in the book that's coming out as of the well-written but serious academic variety. You can also see him and hear him on TMBS with both Main Show and, of course, Illicit Histories. Djene, I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Michael. You take care of yourself.
Thanks, brother. All right, folks. Another banger. We're going to go to the fun half where we'll take your calls and IMs. We got to do a bit of a actually TMBS-style illicit history of Guatemala and El Salvador, because the only good thing about Elliot Abrams, well, I mean, first was watching Ilhan Omar kick his ass, and the contrast of, like, you know, a noble, promising young progressive leader versus just like this grotesque, hideous old ghoul was very satisfying. But it's worth digging into the history of, you know, crimes that he and the Reagan administration were an intimate part of. And also, you know, the fact that this twerp complex in Washington's big response is not to go, oh, shit, maybe we should, you know, at least put out a report on the support of the Reagan administration for what is literally an internationally recognized genocide in Guatemala in the 1980s. No, it's don't be rude to Elliot Abrams. I'm a big critic, as I keep saying, of all sorts of internet toxicity. There's an essay called Exiting the Vampire Castle that I would recommend people read if you're interested in that. But if there is a place where, you know, this is a good example where Elliot Abrams, yes. Be much more patient with your fellow humans in general and realize.
Don't cancel Elliot Abrams.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. I will say we are 2 away from our first 2,000 TMBS page. Oh, wait. Well, first of all, sorry, before I get to that, become a member of the Majority Report today. Less than pennies a day gets you jam-packed content. We were just recording just before. I mean, next week we're on vacation, but you're going to get 4 new excellent interviews and then some incredible work from the MRI archives back in the MR days. And some of these interviews, particularly Bill Zonik on stock buybacks, and another excellent piece of intellectual history debunking the IQ and race trash that, you know, happily Sam Harris drearily, and I mean happily, not literally, Sam Harris drearily resuscitated for a whole bunch of new people. Thank you so much. A great intellectual history there, debunking and really discovering the origins of that dangerous garbage. So you maintain independent media. You maintain everything that we do unbought, unbossed by becoming a member of the Majority Report today, supporting justcoffee.coop, subscribing on YouTube, and, you know, all the rest of it. TMBS is 2 patrons away from our first 2,000 patrons. So go there. We're doing a tremendous amount of work. This weekend, illicit history of why the 1970s post-colonial nationalist movements and global effort to reorder the global economy failed, and the Michael Manley experiment in Jamaica with Professor Adam Chetichu. She has a new great book out and teaches at the University of Chicago. Mark Blythe was on yesterday. We're doing a special show on Friday because we're off next week. We're going to be fun, and Big Waz is going to call in. Now there's a link on the Majority, and so patreon.com/TMBS, patreon.com/TMBS. Also go and subscribe to the Michael Brooks Show on YouTube. April 20th, we packed the Bell House, and now it's time for us to pack the Bootleg Theater in LA. Incredibly excited about the second Michael Brooks Show live show. Tickets are available now. If they continue selling at the rate that they have in the first day they've been up with very little promotion, we're going to be sold out like in a matter of weeks. And this is even before Anna Kasparian, who's going to be one of our esteemed guests, starts hyping it on TYT. So get your tickets quickly, click on the link, and come see Left is Best West Coast Fest with the fellas from the TMBS crew and our great guests, Wozni Lambre, Big Waz, Anna Kasparian, and Nando Vila. Matt.
Literary hangover on Saturday. Coming is The Unparalleled Adventures of One Hans Fall, which is about a guy who reacts to his artisanal industry, which is a bellows mender, which a bellows is how you would blow air into fireplaces. That gets taken away by capitalism. The artisanal system gets taken away, so he decides to blow up his creditors and go to the moon in a hot air balloon. And it's early sci-fi, so...
Wanted to give that character a little fun.
And
fanfare.
we do the entire short story. It's an hour and 40 minutes. The whole episode's going to be like in the it's going to be in the Dan Carlin, Joe Rogan length of podcast. It's going to be up like 3 hours and 40 minutes, but that'll be out on Saturday.
That sounds great. It reminds me of because we were talking about how, like Rush Limbaugh's bumper music is actually like a really good song, and it's about basically like Ohio being ruined by strip malls. And it sort of, to the extent that the song does have politics, and it has some, it's like completely antithetical to Rush Limbaugh. But I was just thinking of that short story in relationship to Ohio by the Pretenders. And of course, big announcement, Brendan Finn's Jerry's Dead, Fish Sucks, Get a Job podcast has been launched. All right, folks, we'll see you on the fun half. Oh, we will see you on the fun half. We'll see you on the fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just want to degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Almost says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
I am a total cunt.
Can we bring back DJ Dannerky's song, please?
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Dannerky.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break for people.
That's fucking nonsense.
Hey, folks, reminder.
I do not have Parkinson's.
And the alpha males are
psych. Fuck 'em.
Almost says what?
Almost
says what?
Hell of a lot of bank. 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 Hell of a lot of bank.
All lives matter. Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black.
See Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keep it at 100. Can't knock the hustle. Come on! Fuck 'em. Things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday! Happy birthday to me, Jew boy!
I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are back. Africans are black.
Come on! Come on! Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
Someone does need to pay the price for blasphemy. I don't remember how we got into a Nation of Islam Obama on Salman Rushdie riff, but I'm definitely here for it.
I mean, that's an old song now. It's not getting stale, but that was Kelly era.
That was Kelly era. So I mean, but I don't know. I will keep playing it forever. But D'Anarchy's a genius and has a hell of a lot up his sleeve, including of course the TMBS intro music and all of our interstitials we've been using for everything. Tim from Boston, considering that a Saudi power broker was quoted in the Financial Times as telling John Kerry when he was Secretary of State that ISIS was a Saudi response to U.S. influence to limit U.S. failure to limit the influence of Iran and Iraq post-invasion, I was shocked that your guest didn't seem to associate ISIS with the Saudi sphere of influence in the region. Well, he didn't deny that. I mean, look, the truth is more complicated than just that one piece. The Saudis, I definitely think that the Saudis have funded ISIS, and the other the Emiratis too. They also funded groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, and I think what happened probably around in 2014 is that the kind of weird, like, ISIS was more isolated relative to those other groups. Now, there's al-Qaeda adjacent groups who've gotten weapons from the United States. I mean, in a highly contradictory Syria policy. And as always, I need to say, as I state that fact, which upsets other people, with some people, I'll upset other people by reminding other people that Assad is a horrific criminal and butcher. All of these things are happening simultaneously, but that's not a fair read of Djene. Also, he's the man is a serious academic, and he's gonna, not get ahead of himself with claims. But I don't think anybody would deny that. In terms of initial funding sources, and definitely ongoing with other very similar groups to Al-Qaeda, to ISIS, including Jabhat al-Nusra being, I think, the most important one. Oh my God, are you fucking kidding me? Local pizza historian, please, for the love of God, learn what a coup is. South American countries are allowed to change leaders without it being a coup. So, first of all, I'm going to try to interpret you as best I can. If your broader point about using the word coup to support things to describe like the 1950s coup in Guatemala that took Arbenz from power, that was conducted by the CIA, or what brought Allende out of power, or what brought the Brazilian military dictatorship into power, or what took Manuel Zelaya out of power in 2009. If you're disputing the use of the word coup generally, there's nothing controversial historically about discussing U.S.-backed coups in Latin America. So I'll try to be generous, but the frame of your question is highly suspect and makes you sound historically illiterate and stupid. If you're talking specifically about Venezuela, let's break it down again really patiently. The Maduro government has undeniable, serious internal failings and problems. Eva Gollinger, who advised Hugo Chavez and knows these players well, says in the conclusion of her book, look, there's no doubt that corruption and systemic problems emanate from the top right now, and that the historical and real achievements of Hugo Chavez have not been sustained. Now, there's still many people in the Bolivarian movement fighting to defend what is a honorable and correct legacy, which I totally stand by. So, that is in conjunction with the fact that the 2002 coup, where there was a military siege that put Chavez in jail, and then a guy literally came out with like some type of, aristocratic sash and appointed himself president, and the New York Times celebrated and the Bush administration backed financially and diplomatically. Yes, that's a coup. And every single step of the way, through sanctions, through economic sabotage, and through all sorts of other covert mechanisms that are less well reported on but highly documented, including funding opposition groups, and manufacturing crises in Venezuela, the United States has been wanting governmental change there the whole time. Now you have a guy who has just declared himself president, and the United States is threatening military action along with two other authoritarian, governments, frankly, at least in terms of the ideology of those in power, Brazil and Colombia. So if you can't understand that that's a coup, that that's a U.S. instigated effort to take somebody who has no institutional legitimacy to just declare himself president. Again, here's the easy analogy. If Nancy Pelosi tomorrow said, I'm president, and then took refuge in the Chinese embassy, and China said, we recognize her, and Nancy Pelosi said, and I'm considering whether or not to invite China to invade the United States, that would be a attempted coup. So I hope you enjoyed this little basic history and terminology lesson, and I hope you learn and don't come to me with that fucking nonsense ever again. Response to Isha from Kashmir. Last week, February 5th, Kashmirites around the world observed Kashmir Solidarity Day. I just wanted to point out as a Kashmiri myself that Kashmiris know and experience far more brutal repression from Indian police forces whenever the BJP, who are basically RSS acolytes, are in power. It seems fascists are horrible through time and space. Walk away from the dark side, Isha. Leave these fascists. I have hope for you. No, do you remember? Well, Isha has a lot of. She likes Modi and Tulsi. That's a good I am.
Isha likes Modi and Tulsi.
Not the Isha you're thinking of.
Oh, okay, sorry.
There's a caller. There's two different.
Oh,
Ishas.
yes, right, gotcha. Oh, yeah.
Jair Bolsonaro flooded. Jair Bolsonaro's flooded left lung. The revolution that started in John McCain's brain and continued in Charlie Kirk's blood vessel has now gone international. Thanks for all the support. I hope I won't let you down. Majority Report thought, happy Valentine's Day to all the succulent gentlemen in the studio. Well, thank you. Thank you. Train Boy, I still can't believe that in a day when it comes out that we are driving insects to extinction, Chelsea Clinton would order the murder of insect American activist Adam Friedland. Shameful.
Nice one, Train
That's
Boy.
Definitely a fan of a certain show in the audience. I think now I've listened enough to that show to publicly affirm I'm a fan of it. I still don't listen to like every episode, but I've heard enough. It's funny. Give him his account back. Bullprog, can you believe Elon blood libeled Elliot Abrams in that hearing? See, that is what happens when you cynically weaponize real things. Sometimes, when we were watching that just catastrophic Christine Quinn segment defending Amy Klobuchar bruising her staff, it was like, you realize what you're actually doing here is completely undermining and delegitimizing the extraordinarily serious conversation of double standards for women candidates by doing this mind-blowingly cynical, stupid propaganda.
And if you were a fascist who was against all of these things, you would just do that to blow the wads.
Oh yeah, that's anti-Semitism, that's sexism, that's race. Of course, because you muddy the waters, you make it all seem ridiculous. Pajama Boy, hey Michael, I noticed that Tulsi Gabbard fans are incredibly annoying. Are they going to be the worst supporters in this election cycle? I gotta tell you, well, first of all, that you're a fucking sellout for asking that question. Tulsi Gabbard's only ever talked about pace.
Dave Weigel took a picture of Tulsi, I think, in Iowa to a fairly decent-sized crowd, although Elizabeth Warren also had a big crowd in Iowa, so maybe Iowa.
I think Iowans like to check out their candidates.
That's the politics is like their Super Bowl.
It is like literally Super Bowl for
them. But I had a vision that Tulsi is going to perform really well for some reason.
Let me just apply the same standard though that I'm really trying to apply to all the candidates. I'll do the usual stipulation. If Bernie Sanders jumps in, I'm supporting him 100%. If he doesn't, God forbid, my support, which will not be as fervent, but it will transfer to Elizabeth Warren. And besides that, though, I really want, other than, okay, let me take somebody easy. Terry McAuliffe, right? Like, whatever, dude. But I am really trying to practice an ecumenical people can improve school of policy. And of growth and leadership. So what Tulsi Gabbard has said since she's been running for president is good. Now, there's really disturbing linkages in her background, just as Kamala Harris, even if what she is saying is good, has a horrifying record as a prosecutor. So, look, I stand by all of the criticisms and all of the reporting of Tulsi 100%. And there's no doubt that people relate to Tulsi as a personality cult. I think, to be honest, it's overrepresented in our spaces because I think if you wanted to look, you could find certainly annoying cult-like attitudes to every candidate. And obviously the frigging president of the United States has a dangerous white nationalist cult propping him up every day. But I'm going to take that attitude towards Tulsi. And look, if the time ever comes about actually voting for her in a primary, the fact that this connection to fascist forces in India and voting against Syrian refugees, I mean, I've done this. These are serious, fundamental, structural problems, just as Kamala Harris's prosecutorial record are serious, fundamental, structural problems to me. But then conversely, any of them can evolve and improve. All of them have strong points and weak points. I think they all, frankly, pale in comparison, to Bernie. That's just my view. I think they're just not as good, period. Not that he's perfect. You shouldn't have a cult about him, but I'm sorry. The ongoing hot take of Bernie Sanders is he's good. Sorry. He's a good candidate. He's right about the main issues, and he actually overall has a very good track record. So he's the one to support, in my estimation, if you have any kind of genuine progressive politics. But Tulsi Gabbard has been good on the trail. So I'm not going to, I'm not going to indulge in what I'm criticizing in others, right? I don't want to turn it into like an axe to grind. She said good things about Venezuela. She was actually the only candidate to tweet out about the insect claps, which is extraordinarily important. And then let me just give with one, take with the other. There was also a report on a bunch of campaign contributions she's gotten from arms manufacturers, which I would say for people on the flip side of it. I mean, the last thing I'll say is she clearly falls into a category of both irrational hatred and irrational cultism. And I say this as somebody who's not a fan and has serious problems, but on the irrational culthood side, if you saw that a candidate received a ton of money from General Dynamics and then supported drone policies, you would correctly call that for what it was. Why can't you do that with Tulsi? But then conversely, there's a lot of people who, they hate her for the wrong reasons, and they're not going to give her props when she says something that's right. And she's been saying a lot of things that sound good to me. Medicare for all, PAYGO, Venezuela, the environment, so cool. What else can I say? I think hopefully we can all carry a little bit more of that kind of vibe. You're calling from a 647 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hey, it's Sebastian. I'm calling from Canada.
Hey, Sebastian. What's on your mind?
Hey, I want to talk about the snap election that's going to happen in Spain.
Oh, talk about it. I don't know anything about it. I'm way behind on it.
All right. Well, so the Spanish government fell after their budget proposal was voted down by the parliament. And it's a really important election because the People's Party, the Popular Party, I don't really know how to translate it. In Spanish, it's the Popular Party. But anyway, they've just nominated as their leader this guy who's like, I guess you could compare him to like how Marine Le Pen is in France. He's an extreme right-wing nationalist. He said stuff like he wants to conquer all of Catalonia. He wants to make abortion illegal. So there was another thing where like the current government wanted to exhume the remains of Franco.
Yeah.
Which is currently, where Franco is buried right now is like it's basically like a shrine or like a location of pilgrimage for extreme right-wing, neo-Nazis, basically all over Europe.
Yep.
And so he said he wants to keep Franco's remains there. He said stuff like,
okay, so I understand he's really, really bad. I am familiar with this person, and I should look to do some content about it. But yeah, like kind of get to the point. Unless it's, I mean, by the way, if your point is just to warn how horrible he is, that's totally legitimate. But
well, yeah. So my point is, there's sort of a problem right now with like how the different left-wing parties are trying to organize around stopping him.
Okay.
Because what happened in 2015 was there was the emergence of the Podemos party.
Right.
and that really disturbed there had traditionally been the far left in Spain. After the Socialist Party dropped Marxism from its platform, then there was a contingent of it that broke off.
Yep.
And so the Socialist Party basically became like a sort of like a.
But they moved
party,
a little bit back to the left under this prime minister. So anyways, but just, distill it. This is fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
If it was just you and I talking, I'd go on forever, but we're pretty tight.
Yeah. Well, so basically they had to do that because they're a minority government. And it was the first minority government in the history of Spain.
Okay, so what's your but right now they're in elections, so yeah, get to it. Please.
Okay, well, that's just about it. Like, just I don't know, talk about it, pay attention to it. It's important. It's the fourth largest economy in the Eurozone.
100%, and I will work to do more content on it myself. And it's a bummer that Podemos is having a lot of internal problems, but they're a really promising party. Thanks for the call, man. All right, let's okay, we'll touch on this briefly. John Spiegler is a cuck. I don't know who that is. Amazon has pulled out of its plans for NYC. Thoughts? And then let's see. Look, yeah, Amazon announced today that they are pulling out of New York City. Amazon, this is quoting now from the New York Times. Amazon said on Thursday that it was canceling plans to build. Hell yeah, dude. I don't even remember, though. What was the Hotline Bling dance?
Scalia died.
Oh, no, I know. This is the one where he does this, right? Oh, okay. Okay. Amazon is canceled. Fuck you. Goodbye. Peace. You're not going to make our subway system even worse than it already is. Long Island City is saved. Fuck you.
Sorry to all you that have already bought
I'm
property.
sorry. Oh, that's a shame.
I wonder if there's a return policy on that.
Oh, yeah. Maybe we could use your base tip to pay off the condo that you bought.
Not so prime real estate now, is it?
Woo! Woo! Organizing works, people. Organizing works. It was an incredible testament, though, to the passing of the baton to, like, real progressive forces. Like, Bill de Blasio has done some really good things. He's done some really bad things. I totally, in the elections where he was up, I'm glad I voted for him. But him going up there talking about the synergy between Amazon and a housing project, I mean, some of the most disturbing, ridiculous, dystopian nonsense from any public official in our country. And of course, we all know what Andrew Cuomo is. So this is a great victory for New York. It's a great victory for labor organizing. And I hope other cities will take a page out of this. Like, no. I mean, Amazon is a, we'll get to that in a second. Amazon is a structural danger to the well-being of the country, labor forces, supply chains. I actually love a point that Corey Pine made, which was like, you need to have more friction than what Amazon provides. You need to be willing to wait an extra day. The human cost of frictionless delivery like that is innately abusive to people. And Amazon, I mean, that's the bigger point. The sort of also very significant point, obviously, is the notion of giving this not only hugely profitable, but like, potentially the most structurally dangerous monopoly of our time, additional money to bribe them to come here to drive up rents and make this city even more gentrified and clog up our public transportation, because of course there's no money that's going to get pumped into subways. We're going to use that for a helipad. Is just, I mean, well, it was to be. Let me not be as polemical. It was extraordinarily short-sighted policymaking, which takes us to this tweet, because Bakari Sellers, and I just want to get this. I don't really know who Bakari Sellers is, frankly. I know that he's a pundit and a former politician, and I know that he supports Hillary Clinton. And he seems to get into a lot of beef with Bernie people on Twitter. And I don't ride on that stuff that much. I mean, it's obviously where I stand, but I don't really see a need to sort of fight with people about these things every 5 seconds. But and when I've seen him on TV, he seems like a nice guy, and certainly when he's paired up against a Republican, he's good. That being said, just a relentless, a supporter of the anything Israel wants, anytime, anywhere, any place variety, which is always why it's a decent idea to see him with his picture of Shmuley Boteach. And just, again, to be clear, like Elie Wiesel, unfortunately, towards the end of his life, said some really despicable things in defense of Israeli atrocities in Gaza. Elie Wiesel is also a Holocaust survivor personally, and he wrote some really good books. And, he still was an important figure in our national discourse, one that should and needed to be critiqued. But just as a contrast, I mean, Shmuley Boteach, he's a right-wing nothing. I don't even understand how he gets into all of these pictures of Bakari Sellers and Steve Bannon. I know that he literally was Michael Jackson's rabbi. That is why he is in national consciousness. So Bakari Sellers, obviously that part of his record is bad. And now we look at this, which is this totally lame-ass tweet, and I'm wondering if he's looking for some type of consulting or lobbying contract here, because Bakari Sellers tweets out at 11:58 a.m. today, opposing Amazon and NYC was very short-sighted. And what's extraordinary, though, is that it's just the absolute inverse of true. Because, I had no beef, honestly, with labor unions that were like, hey, this is going to happen. Let's get some good building trades jobs. The truth is, for working people, obviously things are incredibly tight. And that's an understandable perspective. But one that I would say, and I'm in no right to say what their decision should be in that sense as a non-union person, but I could tell you as an objective political analyst, that's a short-sighted move. Because if Amazon comes into the city, it's going to have a huge structural undermining effect of what remnants remain of the middle and working class in this city, and it's an anti-union company. And there's no doubt that that is going to have a spillover effect with the oligarchy of New York City, a corporate right-wing Democratic governor. So Bakari Sellers with the opposite day tweet of the week.
This is just billionaires being babies again.
That's all
this is
it is.
Howard Schultz being pissed because Seattle won't build a new arena for the Sonics. So he moves them. And this is Bezos being like, well, we wanted to help the community so much, but only if you give us all this shit and give me a helipad and then subsidize our $100K plus salaries for people to move here.
Yeah, Sellers is a pro-business Democrat. He was on a panel with Sam at a Politicon, and he was definitely right of everyone on there. But I think the problem is him coming from like a rural South Carolina background. It's like, yeah, no businesses want to go there. We have to do everything we can to incentivize them to go here.
Right.
But we're talking about New York City and giving away $3 billion in tax credits to build this thing. Like, it's completely unnecessary.
That's actually a really good point. I'm sure that frames his perspective, and that's fair.
That's a big American divide too.
Right.
I mean, there was a viral review of Olive Garden that came out in Grand Forks, North Dakota when I was in college, because this woman's like, we got an Olive Garden to finally come here. And that is I remember getting excited about like certain sporting goods stores.
No, dude, even growing up in rural Massachusetts, I mean, and it was different, but because there was big fluctuations within a pretty small geographic area. So there was definitely like middle class college town types of people that can support a bunch of nice like coffee shops and independent bookstores, and they don't want big box stores. But then there also was, you drove 40 minutes out. I mean, there was some like legit rural poverty. And of course people wanted a Walmart built. But I think, that's a very astute point with Bakari. But it's also like what I love about this too, and the tantrum that Amazon's throwing. I mean, first of all, obviously we're dodging a bullet here, but it's also like what's awesome is that they've gotten such pushback that they need to take their ball and go home and have this little hissy fit. When, of course, as we pointed out in the beginning, this whole thing of like all these cities across America are going to compete for us. I mean, this horrifying, like feudalistic Hunger Games thing was also extraordinarily bullshit because, they picked DC metro area and New York, places they clearly want to be. So in other words, what's very funny about this actually is that if Amazon wasn't short-sighted, and if Amazon wasn't so goddamn relentlessly greedy, they could have just said, we're opening in New York City and we're not going to try to like steal $3 billion and throw away your tax money for it. Like, we're going to come here. We're going to cause more gentrification. We're going to clog the public transit system. We're going to be obviously horrible corporate citizens and make New York suck even more. But we don't have to do the cherry on top of taking $3 billion out of the state budget that could be spent on like anything else of better use. Because they did that, they got this great pushback, and now they have to whine and go like, oh, I guess you don't want us. What's hilarious is that they clearly wanted to be here. So it makes it all the more hotline bling.
Another great thing is, and very pedantic as well, but Cuomo is still Amazon Cuomo.
Still
despite
Amazon.
the deal falling through.
Still Amazon Cuomo, and it's a tough deal.
He's just going to say it's for climate change. Actually, that'd be nice if you could need somebody to stand up for the Amazon these days.
That would be great.
Nice if Jeff Bezos would give a shit about the real Amazon.
Yeah, maybe Jeff Bezos could take a stand against J.R. Bolsonaro's commitment to clear cut the Amazon. I'd be much more interested in it. Or maybe just closer to home, he could just make sure none of his employees are homeless versus doing some stupid viral video about how he's going to fund some dumb project. Maybe he could just stop. By the way, an exploitation is a technical term, so all employees are exploited, but maybe he could stop exploiting them so much. All right, I want to get into this a little bit. Do we also have the one from the BBC? So, and again, we're going to cover this more tomorrow because Elliot Abrams, in addition to being a horrible ghoul in and of himself, is a door. He's one of these people you can use as a door to understand, crimes across the globe, U.S.-backed crimes from Latin America to the Middle East. There's a whole world to lay to waste. He doesn't have the power and the clout, but there is a kind of Kissingerian element here of blood on his hands across the globe. And Elliot Abrams, and so we'll play the clip where, it's just exquisite, and Ilhan Omar is one of the best members of Congress we have, and solidarity. And his pestilent whining was also quite enjoyable to watch. But let's take this as a door here to understand exactly who this guy is and what his background is. And also, by the way, going back to the stupid coup question of earlier, this is the point person on Venezuela. Trump, the reason he's testifying to Congress is because the Trump administration and Mike Pompeo want this guy whose background is in backing death squads, mass murder mafia states, covering up the mass rape and slaughter of people, including children as young as babies, to be the point person on Venezuela. So again, let's be very clear. This isn't just a history lesson. This is a contemporary threat emanating from the United States to the people of Venezuela. So let's start with this sound. This is Elliot Abrams back in the 1980s. I don't think I see this one on the sound sheet. No, the one where he's talking.
With Alan Nairn?
This is him with Alan Nair. It's not on the sound sheet. So
Alan Nair and Elliot Abrams on with Charlie Rose in 1995.
Talking about Guatemala.
Okay, so we're going to talk about Guatemala and El Salvador. We're going to do two little history lessons here, but this is defending. And again, I want to just give this setup by saying the general in charge of Guatemala in the 1980s that Elliot Abrams is justifying and who backed is in prison right now for 80 years for genocide. This is a matter of public record. This is not just laudable lefty reporting. This is Elliot Abrams in 1995.
I think you have to apply uniform standards. President Bush once talked about putting Saddam Hussein on trial for crimes against humanity, Nuremberg-style tribunal. I think that's a good idea. But if you're serious, you have to be even-handed. If we look at a case like this, I think we have to start talking about putting Guatemalan and U.S. officials on trial. I think someone like Mr. Abrams would be a fit subject for such a Nuremberg-style inquiry. But I agree with Mr. Abrams that Democrats would have to be in the dock with him. The Congress has been in on this. The Congress approved the sale of 16,000 M16s to Guatemala. In 87 and 88...
Hold on one second. Before
Pause it.
They voted more...
I don't know who this guy is, but he's a hero.
Alan Nairn.
Okay. Okay, I actually do know that name, but I don't know him well. This is amazing. And watch, I mean, of course, Abrams, this is actually a preview of his sleazy response. I mean, look at him, to Ilhan Omar, but also look at Charlie Rose being like, whoa, don't get impolite here. Go ahead.
Abrams, the Democrats would have to be in the dock with him. The Congress has been in on this. The Congress approved the sale of 16,000 M16s to Guatemala. In 87 and 88...
Hold on one second. Because
they voted more military aid than the Republicans asked for.
Again, I invite you and Elliot Abrams back to discuss what he did. But right
thanks,
now...
Charlie, but I
hold on one second, Elliot. Go ahead. You want to repeat the question of you want to be in the dock?
It is ludicrous to respond to that kind of stupidity. This guy thinks we were on the wrong side in the Cold War. Maybe he personally was on the wrong side. I am one of the many millions of Americans who
Mr. Abrams, you were on the wrong side in supporting the massacre of peasants and organizers.
What I want to do is I want to ask the following
question. And that's a crime. That's a crime, Mr. Abrams, for which people should be tried.
Yes, right. We'll put all the American officials who won the Cold War in the dock.
All right.
Okay, I'm not mad at that. Let's play this clip from the BBC. This is 2013, and this is the general. Of course, Elliot Abrams should be sitting right alongside him, and Ronald Reagan and all these other goons. But he did actually face consequences. This is a BBC report.
After 36 years of civil war in which 200,000 people were killed, few thought this moment would come. The former military leader of Guatemala, Efrain Rios Montt, in court to hear his sentence on charges of genocide and crimes against humanity. In court too, some of the thousands of victims, members of the Ixchil ethnic group, who day after day had testified over the rape, torture and murder the military had inflicted on them and their families during Rios Montt's time in power.
I know this doesn't erase the pain, but it guarantees that the atrocities committed by the Guatemalan army won't be repeated. My brother can finally rest in peace, and that thug will finally go to prison, and that means a lot in this country where there's so much impunity. And
now I'm going to quote from a piece from 2013 by Greg Graydon. Guatemalan slaughter was part of Reagan's hard line. In 1966, the U.S. Army's Handbook of Counterinsurgency Guidelines summarized the results of a war game waged in a fictitious country unmistakably modeled on Guatemala. The rules allowed players to use quote-unquote selective terror, but prohibited quote-unquote mass terror, genocide. The guidelines stipulated was not an alternative. A decade and a half later, genocide indeed was an option in Guatemala, supported materially and morally by Ronald Reagan's White House. Reagan famously took a hard line in Central America, coming under strong criticism for supporting the Contras in Nicaragua and financing the counterinsurgency in El Salvador. His administration's actions in Guatemala are less well known, but even before the 1980 election, two retired generals who played prominent roles in Reagan's campaign reportedly traveled to Central America and told Guatemalan officials that, quote, Mr. Reagan recognizes that a good deal of dirty work has to be done. Once in office, Reagan continued to supply munitions and training to the Guatemalan army, despite a ban on military aid imposed by the Carter administration. That led, and just briefly once more, and Reagan was consistent in his moral backing for Guatemala's genocide errors. In December 5th, 1982, for instance, he met with Rios Montt, the man we just saw in that clip, who was in prison for 30 years for genocide, in Honduras, and said, quote, he was a man of great integrity and dedicated to democracy. El Salvador, and of course, Elliot Abrams is the point person for this. In El Salvador, this is a contemporaneous report, I believe it was Peter Jennings, actually, of some of these death squads backed in El Salvador. These are the types of people that Elliot Abrams was working with Ronald Reagan.
El Salvador right wing and the presidential candidate of ARENA, a slick, well-financed organization that is more than a political party. It's a paramilitary operation. When Dobison accepted the presidential nomination, he denounced death squads and violence, and he warned the United States not to make any threats against the El Salvador army. But this week, the Los Angeles Times and the Albuquerque Journal reported that one wing of ARENA is made up of death squads. The death squads strike at anyone they suspect of working for the guerrillas or sympathizing with them, even when friends are involved.
Say I'm a businessman. I sit down and I have decided, along with my other friends, that you're a communist and you must die. I could pay one of my bodyguards to have you killed. That's one type of operation.
Even if we're social friends, that happens.
There was one man who very painfully told us that he had to sacrifice a friend of his in the name of free enterprise.
So that's what we're talking about here. And now I'm going to quote from John Schwartz in The Intercept. In December 11th, 1981, in El Salvador, a Salvadoran military unit created and trained by the U.S. Army began slaughtering everyone they could find in a remote village called El Mozante. Before murdering the women and girls, the soldiers raped them repeatedly, including some as young as 10 years old. They joked that their favorites were the 12-year-olds. One witness described a soldier tossing a 3-year-old child into the air and impaling him with his bayonet. The final death toll was over 800 people. The next day on December 12th, the first day in the job for Elliott Abrams as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs in the Reagan administration, Abrams snapped into action, helping to cover up the massacre. News reports of what had happened, Abrams told the Senate, were, quote-unquote, not credible, and, quote, the whole thing was being significantly misused as propaganda by anti-government guerrillas. This past Friday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo named Abrams as a special envoy for Venezuela. According to Pompeo, Abrams will have, quote, responsibility for all things related in our efforts to restore democracy in the oil-rich nation. The choice of Abrams sends a clear message to Venezuela and the world. The Trump administration intends to brutalize Venezuela while producing a stream of unctuous rhetoric about America's love for democracy and human rights. Combining these two factors, the brutality and the unctuousness, is Abrams' core competency. And the piece is Elliott Abrams, Trump's pick to bring democracy to Venezuela, has spent his life crushing democracy. It's by John Schwartz in The Intercept. So look, both we should know, and of course this also could be quite correlated with ongoing U.S. support of right-wing forces in Central America, and this of course correlates with issues related to migrants and people fleeing violence and coming here, and the white nationalism of the same Trump administration trying to foment a coup in Venezuela. But it's a vital history lesson that everybody should and needs to know if you're an American. And it's present because this is the game plan in Venezuela. And that's why, again, I'm not going to make excuses or airbrush the failings of the present government. But this is not the issue. The issue is right-wing forces and a coup and an administration tapping a point person who has gallons and gallons and gallons and gallons of blood on his hands. And the position of Maduro and the position of the Mexicans and the positions of the Uruguayans and the positions of all moderate, sane forces is that there does need to be some type of diplomatic process. I don't know how that works, frankly, because squeezed in the middle of Venezuelans of all classes who are really suffering because of all of these different factors is the fact that you have a Bolivarian revolution that has a real and positive history and has done some great things. It's also done some very bad things, and it has internal contradictions and has faced the relentless pressure of the United States. And the political representations of the opposition are U.S. manufactured far-right forces trying to have a coup there. So I don't know who you do diplomacy with, but I do know that you oppose U.S. action there, period. And Ilhan Omar is a hero. Now, there's some people that disagree with me about Ilhan Omar. And this is pretty extraordinary because I'll give you this. At least Elliott Abrams, well, he's, as he said, that core competency of covering up slaughter and being an unctuous, liar. But at least he's coming out and saying, "Oh, that isn't true," and democracy and winning the Cold War. at least his sociopathy and lies are somewhat on the ball. But leave it to Kelly Magsamen, and I think we also, I don't know if we have the one from Max Boot as well, but Kelly Magsamen.
She's a VP at Center of American Progress Security.
Okay, so you would assume, and I just want to be really clear about this. And look, obviously, U.S. empire and U.S. abuse of rights is a bipartisan affair. You see this in Venezuela, only a handful of Democrats willing to speak out about coup-mongering there. That being said, some of these issues actually that specifically relate to the Abrams profile were actually opposed by Democrats at the time. You saw that Carter had put restrictions on Guatemala, which Reagan lifted, and the U.S. Congress under Democratic votes opposed funding the Contras, which is what led to the Iran-Contra scandal, which is the crimes that Elliott Abrams was pardoned for by George Herbert Walker Bush. But the Iran-Contra affair literally leads to things like selling arms illegally to Iran to wash money back to fund these death squads because the U.S. Congress will not vote to give the Contras money, and also the cocaine smuggling that the CIA was complicit in. So you're talking people like Chris Dodd and John Kerry opposed some of these policies in the present moment. So the base here is extraordinarily low. Okay, that I'm giving you a huge mulligan here, which feels pretty weird for opposing genocide and the mass rape and murder of children. But I understand DC to some extent. I'll give Kelly Magsamen a mulligan. Or not a mulligan. I'll give her a head start in a race, rather. I'll say, well, I guess obviously you can't speak obvious moral truths if you're in Washington. But again, these obvious moral truths were somewhat at least reflected in the votes of like the mainstream of the Democratic Party in the 1980s. This is her tweet. I worked for Elliott Abrams as a civil servant. He's a fierce advocate for human rights and democracy. Yes, he made some serious professional mistakes and was held accountable. I'm a liberal, but I'm also fair. And we've got a lot of work to do together in Venezuela. I bet. We share goals. I'm sorry, and I should have warned if kids were listening, but let me just go back to some of these serious mistakes that she's not even including. I think she's probably including just his pure criminality with regards to being pardoned for Iran-Contra. A Salvadoran military unit created and trained by the U.S. Army began slaughtering everyone they could find in the remote village of El Bozante. Before murdering the women and children, the soldiers raped them repeatedly, including some as young as 10 years old. Skipping ahead, Abrams snapped into action, helping to lead a cover-up of the massacre. Reports were not credible, said Abrams. Okay, just a little reminder of, again, it is extraordinary to me to be in a position where I do see actually a culture that should be way less punitive and way more forgiving and recognize human mistakes and fallibility and so on and so forth. This is not normal outside of the foreign policy establishment in the United States to cover up the mass murder and rape of children and basically be like, yeah, but he was a nice guy. Now on to her next tweet. No one is not lionizing neocons, which, by the way, is an anti-Semitic term. Oh, really? I wasn't aware of that. We are agreeing on a bipartisan view of the importance of democracy and alliances against authoritarians, even as we have disagreements over other foreign policy issues. This is not hard, people. Well, actually, you know what is hard is that this alliance against authoritarians, which even I would imagine mediocre resistance people like her, I would imagine that those authoritarians include Donald Trump, the administration for which this person who spent the 80s covering up atrocities, and again, this is a fraction of the whole world that he has laid to waste. This guy is a point person for him in a foreign intervention. I don't even know how to, I mean, the only use of a person like her existing is to reveal the just complete, casual, profound immorality of that mindset. And speaking of profound immorality and also, pulling, I mean, it is incredible it's one thing, again, this I can see why people find conservatives less annoying, because the conservatives are the ones who shamelessly and without any knowledge and with complete immorality come out like Brett, Kilmeade, and all they know about foreign policy is getting through Red Dawn a couple of times, and they go, heavy work, and they're just fucking morons, and they just bloviate, and they're just idiots, and of course they've ruined the planet. But it's the liberals and the centrists that are going to both tell you to, killing a kid with a bayonet is actually a lot more complicated than you think when you think about geopolitics. And incidentally, we do need to destabilize Venezuela. But they also are going to flip and get sanctimonious with you or Ilhan Omar for being rude. Which brings us to Max Boot, another person who has a atrocious public record, who's primarily a war propagandist, but because, I guess to his credit, he recognizes that Trump's just overt, grotesque misogyny and racism are inappropriate. Of course, he's embraced by a bunch of idiots who would, who have, Hillary Clinton altars in their homes. Max Boot. Disgraceful ad hominem attacks by @Ilmar, Minnesota on my Council of Foreign Relations at CFR colleague Elliot Abrams. She doesn't seem to realize he was a leading advocate of human rights and democracy, not a promoter of genocide. More evidence of the loony left I caution Democrats about.
He plugs his old column.
And then he plugs his own column. Maybe this is
the same column where he said that we need to have empire for at least another 3 centuries. That one.
Yeah, but woke empire. Let me just do a little bit more reading. And this is Reagan, while, of course, Elliot Abrams was in charge of human rights, humanitarian affairs. This is back to Guatemala, where the genocide took place. I'm saying Max Boot used the phrase genocide. By the way, saying, and I forget who pointed this out. I can't. Maybe it was Discourse Lover on Twitter, but it's correct. That tweet is actually tantamount to Holocaust denial. There is a genocide in Guatemala. This is not a historically contested fact. The Reagan administration backed that government. And you can come and talk about the Cold War and infiltration and all of that shit and whatever, and you want to wank out about it, that's fine. But you don't. You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. Okay. And this is back to the Reagan administration aid for the genocide in Guatemala. The aid helped the Guatemalan military implement a key part of its counterinsurgency plan. Following the massacres, soldiers herded survivors into quote-unquote model villages, detention camps really, where they used food and materials supplied by the U.S. Agency for International Development to establish control. And Reagan was consistent in his moral backing for Guatemala's genocide heirs. That's what I quoted before. And then he called Rios a man of great integrity and totally dedicated to democracy. Continuing to quote Graydon here. Just 10 days after this meeting, one declassified U.S. document reveals that the State Department had been informed of well-founded allegations of large-scale killing of Indian men, women, and children in a remote area by the Guatemalan Army. Other declassified documents reveal that the White House was less concerned with the massacre than with their effectiveness or with countering the bad publicity stemming from the reports of the atrocities. That, of course, was part of Elliot Abrams' brief. Now we have a little bit more here. This is Jay Nordlinger. I don't even know who he is, but he sounds aptly named.
He's a National Review nerd.
Oh, God, here we go. I am not great. This is Jade Nordlinger. I'm not greatly sympathetic to Rep. Omar, surprise, surprise. But really, someone ought to give her a clue on who Elliot Abrams is. The guy's been championing freedom and human rights his entire life and taking unholy shit from the illiberal left and right. Again, I thought the illiberal right, and especially from a completely marginalized, utterly irrelevant rag that has no relationship to anything, that is a fly in Trump's America, I thought the administration that Elliot Abrams is working point on now would be part of the illiberal right. But, again. And then just back to, again, let me just say this. I'll quote a little bit more about this fervent defender of human rights and democracy. John Schwartz in The Intercept. Abrams, who previously served in a multitude of positions in Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush's administrations, often with titles declaring their focus on morality. First, he was an Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizational Affairs in 1981, and then the State Department of Human Rights position mentioned above, 81 to 85, and it goes on to mention a whole bunch of other august positions. He got the job when he was 33 years old. And this is, you know what, let's just keep doing a little Republican history here. Reagan wanted to name Ernest Lefferts as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, but Lefferts' nomination ran to the ground when two of his own brothers revealed that he believed African Americans were, quote, inferior intellectually speaking. A disappointed Reagan was forced to turn to Abrams as second choice. This is who these people are, folks. Ilhan Omar is a hero. And she gave the most classy response to the minuscule amount of good faith criticisms about her tweet. And then maintained her integrity in terms of the policy set with Israel. This guy has laughed off, mocked, dismissed, and lied.
I'm not going to respond to a question that's stupid.
I'm not going to respond to a question that's stupid. Yeah. To a guy who should be in jail, who right now, I mean, this is like some horrifying, like Clint Eastwood, Bruce Willis, like got to get the old guys out of retirement vehicle, except it's the old guys out of retirement to set up death squads in Venezuela and then lie about it. That's his brief. It's disgusting, man. Let's stay on Latin America actually for a second. And I will continue to speak on President Lula's case, and I actually think that history there explains partially why. I mean, of course, Brazil is actually the largest country in Latin America and has a lot more power than others, but it still is subject to intense U.S. interest and interference. And you have a president who anybody with any kind of progressive or social democratic politics should be very interested in because of his enormous achievements, like eliminating hunger in Brazil, like bringing 30 to 40 million people out of poverty, like setting up a independent and rational foreign policy, like supporting indigenous rights, like supporting good environmental policies. Made mistakes, made compromises, of course, but also a workers' party that has natural and organic roots with labor forces in Brazil. And we could see the coup, the corrupt process that brought Dilma Rousseff, and very misogynistic process that brought Dilma Rousseff out of power in 2016, and the jailing without any material evidence of Lula da Silva, when he almost certainly would have been. He was Brazil's last electoral line of defense against a fascist candidate. And the Brazilian judicial system and oligarchs, under the guidance of this horrific prosecutor, Sergio Moro, jailed and silenced him in an election he was winning, and the UN said he should have been able to run in. And the point of this, again, is that this actually, to me, is emblematic of the sort of alliance of emergent fascism and capital classes from Wall Street to local oligarchs. Also, more broadly, generic anti-corruption rhetoric is the handmaiden of fascism. 3, people need a much more sophisticated understanding of corruption. There's a shockingly small amount of actual evidence of Lula's corruption, but if you demonstrated that the Workers' Party needed to get involved in various agreements, like in 2005, there was a vote buying scandal. Guess what? That's Brazilian politics. You have to bribe smaller parties to pass your electoral agenda. Those things are a problem structurally. They're fundamentally different than Jair Bolsonaro's son potentially getting direct cash transfers and employing members of a criminal organization. That's a totally different thing. This is Brian Mayer. You have to read him in Brazil Wire, watch the reporting that they do at Telesur and Real News Network, obviously TMBS. Brian's really important on this. And here he is first explaining Judge Sergio Moro, who is the persecutor of Lula, now the justice minister gearing up for a war on labor unions and writing the laws that are flooding Brazil's streets with even more guns. on his role in the persecution and suppression of Lula. And then he ends with this really important declarative statement. And look, I know some people get cynical, and I understand, but there are Democrats that put themselves in a progressive position and want to be understood as progressives, and some really are progressives. And Bernie Sanders has done a little bit of this. Barbara Lee's done a little bit of this, but they need to be front and center on Brazilian democracy and freeing Lula da Silva.
What Moro's role really was during his prosecution against Lula was inquisitor. You know, the investigator can rule on his own investigation. And this isn't the normal situation in Brazil. It's not that common, but they allowed Moro to do it while he was going after Lula. It dates back to the Inquisition. And so how can Lula get a fair trial in this situation? He cannot. And that's why he's in jail, having no material evidence presented against him in either of these two cases.
So what's next now? Is there any chance that Lula could get out of prison someday, or what are his next steps?
Well, Greg, I'm not a fortune teller, but in my opinion, there's going to have to be some kind of regime change before he gets out of jail. They've still got one more Lava Jato investigation against him for an equally or even more ridiculous claim involving his institute, the Lula Institute, and a piece of land. You know, so even if he wins the appeal in these first two cases, they'll charge him on this third case, and they're kind of stalling on it to make sure they can, as long as, you know, Sergio Moro is Minister of Justice and Bolsonaro's president, it's going to be very hard for Lula to get out of jail unless there's really heavy international pressure, and we just don't see that coming from the Democratic Party in the U.S.
You see that coming from center-left leaders in Europe, and apparently there was a new executive meeting of the Labor Party where Corbyn talked about Brazil and Venezuela, but also much more moderate figures like Zapatero and Hollande have defended Lula and this horrific imprisonment. But look, every single Democratic member of Congress needs to hear on this. It's fundamental. It's both because it's extraordinarily wrong the way this person is being treated, and also because it is central to a broader struggle about rights and determination. And also, thirdly, it's a grotesque media failure. I'm not saying that the New York Times needs to report, you know, they can talk about the charges, they can talk about broader corruption probes, but they never contextualize corruption as a systems problem in Brazil, and they also just say he's convicted. They never explain that these court cases have never demonstrated material evidence. They're based on squeezed testimony of people looking to get out of jail by forces who are politically in bed with a profoundly authoritarian and almost certainly profoundly corrupt and overtly dangerous Bolsonaro government. But of course, this is the same New York Times editorial page that endorsed removing Chavez in 2002. Which again, set aside what you think of Chavez. That's an objective interference. Every single Democratic leader needs to speak on freeing Lula. Period. All right. You're calling from a 310 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hey, Mike.
Hey.
Hey, what's going on, brother?
Hey, man. What's on your mind?
Really? Hey, good, man. This is Gary over in Philly, man.
Hey, Gary.
Yeah, first off, really appreciate everything you guys do. Shout out to Matt, Jamie, Sam, the whole crew.
Cool. Thank you.
And I wanted to call. I wanted to just sort of set up a frame real quick, just like using a personal anecdote. But broadly speaking, like you touched on it earlier when you talked about how Dems have this, like liberals can sort of be annoying with this call for civility, and there's this sort of reflexive mindset. And this is something sort of like I've thought about through the years, and I have like three people in my life that run the gamut from far right conservative to like third way centrist, and then a liberal Democrat who even voted for Bernie. in the primary 2 years ago, and we were at dinner last night, and it just sort of struck me at the end of the night that in all three of these cases, those sort of archetypes, the people and the ideas that they represent politically, they're very unaware of sort of the political concept of something that you guys have covered a lot and Sam talks a lot about, which is asymmetric polarization.
Right.
And
right.
The thing that we sort of like, anytime, it doesn't matter if I'm talking to a far right person, a family member who I love, but who's just, he's a Fox viewer, he reads the Wall Street Journal.
Yep.
Or if I talk to my third way centrist friend, he's always sending me pieces by, David Brooks and Ross Douthat, and he sent me the Max Boot piece that just came out, the one that was saying the Dems are, they need to do this. And so last night, this is sort of the third prong of it. Like, this is the liberal Democrat. And even in this case where this guy, we agree on 99% of the things, but there is this, I have found that there is this reflexive need to sort of, there's this self-image that certain liberals have to say, well, I don't identify by party.
Right.
And but what I was trying to communicate to, because he was saying, he sort of made an offhand comment, like, well, unions are the problem. And then he was sharing some personal anecdotes about like individual stories of like inefficient, lazy city workers.
Right.
And I granted him that. I said, yeah, of course. Like, I was like, dude, yes, there are there moments where government workers and like bureaucracies run amok, and but that is not the primary driver in this problem. And the thing that I'm at a loss for where to go, because it seems like no matter what you say, whether it's they just don't understand the true nature of what we're facing in the form of this Republican Party.
I think you're totally right, and I would say in the case of your progressive friend, I think honestly, I'll do a shameless plug. You should be telling them to listen to this show as an example, because I do think with people like that who are already there politically, they just need social permission to not play into those cliches. I think
you need community.
Yeah, you need community. Precisely. And I think and it's funny too, like this is a difference between being in your mid-30s and mid-20s, right? Like, I mean, like, there's plenty of people who are my age who've always had left politics, even publicly so, but have had like the progression of like, oh man, like, do I have to fucking pretend that, that's a problem or what? You know what I'm saying? Like, because there's all these, and that's why we need to be very worried in general, I think, about sort of substituting mores for politics. But I would recommend your friend listen to this show and all the other shows in this universe. I think that would be helpful. Your centrist friend, I don't know, man. I think it's one thing to talk about somebody who's kind of on the center left and bringing them through policy, but I got to say, like, a diet of Douthat, Brooks, and Boot, I mean, does not a sharp mind make. But I guess. I guess in his case, what I would say is if you want, maybe you could give him like books by like Jacob Hacker as an example, who actually, it's less polemical, but it's like the actual numbers on asymmetric polarization and the actual political science of why the cliches that are peddled by those people. And then, your Republican friend, I don't know. I mean, talk about basketball or football or whatever. Thanks for the call, man. I mean, honestly, like, I'm not going to say to stop banging. I mean, I've in fact one really good friend who's professionally radically different politics. I mean, we argue about shit, but you also just have to remember that there is a much bigger life than politics,
And also, like, we have a lot of authors on here that are, I think, good bridges. Like, I mean, Jane Mayer's, I think, my favorite because just a couple of books she's written. But also, like, not Beschloss. Who am I thinking of? I mean, who's the guy who wrote?
Hacker?
No, it was a foreign policy guy. I'll figure it out.
Oh, Walt?
No, he wrote the book about how Jimmy Carter and sort of the move to the Middle East.
Basovich.
Yeah.
Basovich.
Like guys like that, I think, where they're sort of, they have a lot of this sort of prestige, the print prestige to them. I think that's important for people. Like they'd like to see a Pulitzer Prize.
Oh,
winner
definitely.
or something like
for that centrist type, they're very attached to that kind of thing, for sure. All right. Let's play this piece of sound. You know, the theme of this show has been U.S.-backed atrocities and murder across the world. And sometimes, of course, the United States does it itself, as in all of the atrocities in Iraq, as an example. Here's Duncan Hunter, who I thought Duncan Hunter was on his way to jail. I know that his district is apparently so afraid of Muslims that he defeated a very promising candidate running a totally bigoted actual bigoted fear-mongering campaign in actual reality, just like Kevin McCarthy's George Soros, Tom Steyer meme was in fact actually anti-Semitic. Here's Duncan Hunter taking a break from all the various corruption probes about him to say, like, you know, it's totally unfair is the fact that, like, the U.S. military even has rules of engagement. Like, what the fuck?
Matt Goldstein is under suspicion for premeditated murder. Eddie Gallagher is in jail in San Diego, a Navy SEAL that is in trouble for killing bad guys the wrong way. What I think we have here is a case of what the U.S. government would call compassionate combat, meaning the U.S. government for the last 5 years under President Bush and crystallized under President Obama has wanted us to kill the bad guys, but in the right way. Meaning they want us to kill guys compassionately and only under the rules of engagement that they say to. And if you kill the bad guys that we actually say are bad guys the wrong way, well, the U.S. government then is going to try you for murder and put you in jail. Even if you're a decorated Green Beret, if you're a Navy SEAL, if you're Marine Corps Force Recon, that's where we've fallen here. And I think that's the umbrella that all this falls under. That's why Goldstein is in so much trouble. There's supposed to be a thing now, compassionate combat, which doesn't exist. Either you want us to kill the bad guys or you don't.
Matt, what is the Goldstein case?
Yeah, this is from Splinter. The Republican specifically calls out the Republican being Hunter in this case. Hunter specifically calls out several U.S. Service members who are under investigation or on trial for war crimes or murder. Army Major Matthew Goldstein, for instance, is accused of taking a captured Afghan insurgent off the base he was being held at, executing him, and then burning his body in a trash pit to hide the evidence.
You know what's really interesting here? And I hesitate to even go here because this is actually where there is just like a moral full stop, and there isn't really anything other to say other than the fact that a sitting U.S. congressman is on a massive propaganda network for the Republican Party promoting murder and atrocities, which should speak for itself. But the shift under Bush and Obama that he's referring to, and certainly Bush was responsible not only for many civilian casualties, but a global torture regimen. And the drone war of Obama killed an extraordinary amount of innocent people in Pakistan and Yemen. But what they're talking about, and it's funny because he's actually really insulting people that they used to at least lionize, like Stanley McChrystal and David Petraeus, who also have plenty of body counts and blood on their hands. But the theory of COIN, of counterinsurgency strategy, is based off of a pretty simple premise, which is that if you're fighting essentially you're doing police work in the way that police work globally has become highly militarized and is actually a huge problem of the center oppressing the peripheries everywhere. And obviously, you know, Israel-Palestine is kind of the prototype of that dynamic, but you see it in Ferguson as an example. But the theory of COIN is based on the premise that if you need to cooperate with a local village, as an example, to tip you off on a suicide bomb-making factory, it helps if all of the people there don't hate you because you're murdering them. So the theory is that it is in your self-interest to play soccer with the kids, to sit down and have some tea, versus abduct somebody, kill them, and then burn their body in a pit to cover the evidence. So I hesitate to even go to that second order point because that's a congressperson sitting on television advocating murder and atrocities while idiots nod along. But even by their own logic, and I will use that phrase, he's not understanding COIN strategy. And if some fucking Brooklyn socialist Adidas tracksuit guy could fucking break that down for you, there's a big problem there. All right. You're calling from an 832 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hey, this is David. I'm calling from Austin, Texas.
Hey, David, what's going on?
Hey, I actually called last week, but first time calling, I got nervous, and I don't think I made my point very clearly.
Okay, no need to be nervous. What's on your mind?
I'm interested in Israel-Palestine.
Okay.
And I really think that the two-state solution is more likely to happen than the one-state solution.
I don't agree with the premise. That's what's hard for me.
Right. Can I tell you why?
Sure. But you have to tell me. I want to stipulate. So, David, I don't want to be rude, but you got to tell me if it's in the land of abstractions. Like, I have my ideological position, which is I'm a one-state solution guy because I'm generally into like democracy for everybody and not into like identity-based states, period, of any kind, no matter how justified. And I couldn't think of one more justified than Israel. But like, I don't like that Pakistan is Muslim state. I don't like that Iran is a Muslim state. I don't agree with that premise, and I don't like the idea of any even subtle form of second-class citizenship for anyone. But that being said, if we lived in a time where Israel actually stopped building settlements and they actually gave a full no bullshit 67 state to Palestinians, and there was restitution to refugees, and the Palestinians wanted that deal, then cool. I would support that. But right now, it is both totally not on the table. It's completely physically impossible. It is a one state right now. And every person that talks about that mostly right now is talking about a process that's been dead for at least 20 years. And it's a distraction from the issues of the moment. So you got to tell me, in today's world, with today's material conditions, how that statement makes sense as just a logistical one. I don't care about ideological. I'm honestly agnostic.
Right. My point is very logistical. So Israel is really it's going to be in control of what it accepts. And you have to ask yourself, what is Israel more fiercely committed to? What is Israel less likely to give up? The Jewish character of its state or the settlements?
No, they're
There's
wrong.
no doubt.
I'm not trying to. Again, the formulation's wrong. The classic formulation is democracy, identity, and land. And again, I'm not, and I know people get very pedantry on this, but spare me. I understand that. I agree. I think even within 67 borders, it's not exactly a full democracy as we would define it at all. But that being said, there's a big difference inside 67 borders and inside the occupation and the siege on Gaza. So the argument was
exactly.
So let me finish. So the argument was, you can have land, democracy, and Judaism. You can't have all three. What in practicality and actuality, in terms of reality, because it is a one state and has been now for over 60 years, has Israel given up in that formulation? And I got a hint for you. It is not land or identity. It's the D word.
Here's what I would say to that. You're saying that it's one state.
It
I
is.
think that's a word game.
Okay.
No, it's not, because it's
in terms of reality, it is, though. It's run by one country. It's run by one country. It's the opposite of a word game.
That's true.
It is literally
what would it take
one
for
state.
Israel to extend its borders? What would it take for Israel to extend its borders?
They don't need if they need more. If they need, that wouldn't make any difference. The reality is that right now, the only foreign pressure that could be applied on on Israel would be some form of collective social movement, would have some value, and it already does in some ways, and then extreme diplomatic pressure from the United States. Nothing else will impact it. And Israel's obviously already at a point, too, where under Netanyahu and these emergent even further right forces, they don't care about the international PR aspect that leaders like Barak and Olmert cared about. So they're fine with the status quo. It's not a problem for them. If you go and look at the Israeli elections...
Right, the status quo they like.
If
but
you
they're
go
never
and look
gonna
at
take in those Palestinians as citizens.
well, okay.
That's never going to happen.
And the two-state is
It is
never
more
going to
likely
happen. You're
that
talking about two
it is-
total impossibilities as of current politics. The only problem is one
That's
is
right.
already
That's
a,
exactly-
one is already a discredited and done possibility, and the other has a possible
is
future.
not
Thanks for
totally-
the call, man. All right. I just can't. I'm sorry. It's like we're talking 2 + 2 = 4 stuff here. I don't know what to tell you. It's not on the table. And the reality is at least in a one-state situation, you're formulating a response that has to do with the facts on the ground. However that plays out, that we could find a political settlement there that has not been done before. It could be a Lebanese model. It could be a South African full transition to democracy. Maybe those things actually put on the table is actually what forces a two-state. But I actually don't know how you do that now. You'd have to, at this point, uproot. Ironically, you'd actually have to create a flood of Jewish refugees to create a two-state solution. So it's literally not real thinking right now. You're calling from a 571 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Yeah, what's up, bro?
Hey. Yes. What's on your mind? What's your name?
Oh, hey, I'm sorry, man.
No worries.
Jason, I'm from Northern Virginia.
Hey, Jason.
How you
What's
doing,
going
Michael?
on? It's good to be talking with you, Jason. What's on your minds?
Hey, so, I mean, there's a billion ways I could go with this, but what I really wanted to talk about was the Green New Deal and the unwilling to work thing.
Okay.
So how do you vector that?
How do I what to that?
See, to me, yeah, how do you vector that? Like in terms of real
I don't
politics,
vector anything, sir.
Like for example, just the optics of it, just how that played.
But it wasn't in.
and
We've
how
already
that-
covered. Yeah, we already covered it. It wasn't in the final document, Jason. It's not out there, so it's already done. Do you have anything else you want to talk about?
No. Look, bro. I get that, but what I'm saying is that set back the progressive agenda.
All right, I don't think it's such a
by
big
a
deal,
lot,
Jason.
because-
Jason. What did you say? I mean, why would we even reinforce that? Even if I accepted your premise that it was a tiny unforced error, people have already forgotten it, so it doesn't matter. What do you have anything else? Because I don't want to be an asshole. I just want to talk with you about something that I feel is relevant. Do you have anything else that you want to go at?
Okay, so what do you think's relevant? I mean, I could do libertarian all day long. Like we could put that on a spectrum.
Oh no,
libertarian
that's for Sam. I don't
Look,
care
look,
about
look.
that shit.
Oh, okay. Look, dude, here's the thing. Here's the thing, bro. You shut me down inside of 30 seconds.
Okay.
That last caller, you gave him all the rope in the world. You wouldn't even give me fucking 30 seconds.
Yeah, because
right?
you covered something we
Yeah,
covered
dude,
last
we
week.
literally
Okay.
did this last week.
Go
I mean, if
ahead.
you're gonna get upset
What?
about it, we did this last week. I think we even posted the clip. We already talked about this.
You did, but I don't think it was adequate. but
Well, I
that's
think
fine.
it was.
I mean,
Thanks for the call.
Yeah, and don't come with that attitude either.
Yeah,
because that's
not-
a good way to get bumped
it's
very
not-
quickly,
'cause-
even faster than 30 seconds.
Even faster than 30 seconds. You're calling from a 305 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hey, it's Guy from Miami. How's it going, Mike?
Hey, Guy, what's going on?
Michael,
What's on your
right?
mind?
All right. Look, it's good that you're on today because what I want to call about is a show. Your show is one that you did was one that turned me on to this show.
Okay.
Because you were doing this thing on Jonathan Chait, who I've been obsessed with since college because I went to college with the guy. And
Oh, God.
he's cool. He's super talented in terms of being a writer. He was even back then when he was very. Very,
I don't think so.
He was a very good writer, and that's why he went right to the New Republic after college, and basically stayed there
Is he
for a long
hearing that?
time.
sorry.
And he came out with Jesse Walker, who was another who ended up as an editor at Reason. You know, it was a smart group of people. He was the EIC at the Michigan Daily, which is a big, really good daily newspaper. He did a great job.
All right.
He's a nerd. We get it.
We get it. He's a nerd. What is the point, my friend?
Okay.
Yes.
All right. The point is, this guy has been wrong about everything.
There we go.
The most recent thing, the most recent thing that he's been wrong about is he's throwing shade. He basically says that the Green New Deal is bad. He was for the Iraq War. He famously did a long article. I think it was 15,000 words or something on all of the different reasons why the Iraq War would be a great idea.
Yep.
Before the invasion actually happened.
Yep.
The only thing in college, he was the exact same way. He was against affirmative action. He was against what he called political correctness. The only thing that he was quote unquote liberal about was that he wasn't a libertarian. Like he wasn't like a far right libertarian like Jesse Walker was, and he was like pro-abortion, I guess. I mean, I don't know I don't know why the guy calls himself a liberal. He's very persuasive. He's a great polemist, but he is wrong all the time. And even when he's right, he's like when he's close to being right, he's still wrong. The book that he did on Obamacare turned out to be wrong. He said that it was going to live forever and there was nothing that they could do to take it apart.
Mm-hmm.
That's total BS. They've taken it halfway apart already.
I know.
So the guy, like I said.
So there you have it.
I'm
You have it
obsessed
from
with it.
Jonathan Chait's college friend who spent a crazy amount of time talking about how good he was as a writer.
We were more like.
He's wrong.
Yeah,
He's wrong.
Yeah, I was more like his college foil.
Oh, I dig it. Thank you for the call, man. Appreciate it. Thank you. All right. You're calling from a 231 area code. Who are you? Where are you calling from?
Hello, Mike.
Yes.
This is Mohammed from the Bay Area.
Hey, Mohammed. What's going on in your mind?
It's great, except of what's happening in Sudan. I am originally from Sudan.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to thank you for the episode that you did with the Bill Fletcher Jr. He's great.
Yep, he's great.
And also I want to speak about this thing. So one of my relatives in Sudan is she's a lady. She's a teacher. Mm-hmm. She did a broadcast in Khartoum in front of the Belgium school, and we don't know. Yesterday, the Bashir regime security force kidnapped her, and we don't know about her, and that made me think about other people.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, and that made me think about all the other people in Sudan, because every time you think about those things that happen to other people, not to your own family. So this put me in their position. And today, especially that I know that from Twitter that they are targeting women. They are going to especially women, they're taking them arresting them. They go inside the offices and schools and stuff like that just to target women. They try to force, scare Sudanese people to stop the uprising. But I don't think this is going to work, because it's been very inspiration to us. It's gonna continue. It's been continue for 2 months. I'm sorry, I'm a bit nervous. So
No, this is great.
Why don't you?
Can you tell us? I'll continue to cover it. Probably. I mean, I'll do a bit more here, and we'll try to get it into the news packets. Obviously, I'll definitely do more of it on TMBS. But I mean, obviously we can talk about it, and I think there is innate value in just connecting all of us more and more. But what would you like us to do that's within our capacity to do to support this uprising? I mean, it's incredibly important. It's labor-oriented, it's rights-oriented, it's women's-oriented. These are, and this is a regime that in various ways, the remnants of it and the structure of it goes back to the 80s, and the focus here has been on the crimes against humanity of Omar al-Bashir, which is real. And there's also another element of, as I say, labor and austerity, which is striking to me the extent to which this gets no attention here. When it has to do with atrocities in Darfur, which obviously is hugely important. I'm not minimizing that. But Sudan was on the sort of liberal do-goodery list of, the late Bush and early Obama era. And now as this uprising takes place and all of its importance and inspiration and complexity, but also horror and damage and violence, we're not talking about it as much. So, I mean, what would you like us to do?
I especially think that it's important to just to cover it and draw inspiration of it, like for other people, like the fact that the Sudanese people are fighting all those previous perception about them, especially that they forgot about Darfur, and the people from North Sudan, they forgot about Darfur. They didn't pay enough attention, and you heard from Mr. Fletcher Jr. about the racism, the previous racism. Now they are saying that to the Bashir regime, we all Darfur. You can't divide and conquer us.
Yes,
and
right.
I think if more politicians here in the United States pay more attention and just condemn the horrendous act of violence that the Bashir regime want to inflict on Sudanese people for no point whatsoever, because they're not going to give up. They're not going to bow down for all this atrocity, because what can you do? You can't just destroy the economy, destroy the Sudanese people potential, and just do what they did today by kidnapping, targeting women, and accept that you can make the Sudanese people bow down. And I don't think that you can do more than that, just condemning and say that we are all in solidarity with the Sudanese people. And
we are all in solidarity
with
the Sudanese people. We're all in solidarity with the Sudanese people. It's incredible. Thank you for the call. Please continue to call, and I will ramp back out that coverage. If you haven't seen it yet, do watch the conversation. We have it specifically clipped at the TMBS YouTube channel with Bill Fletcher Jr. on the Sudanese uprising. We'll continue.
Thank
Mohammed,
you very much, Mike.
thank you so much. Thank you
very much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. All right, that's the last call of the day, folks. Sorry for those that are waiting. That's, I guess, just the nature of the game now. Also, to be blunt, see?
Too popular.
If you do good cause, you get good responses.
Bro.
Yeah. Could you imagine the difference between that call and I want to talk about a controversy that's done and you already covered? I'm pissed off about it. It doesn't matter. And people probably don't even remember it. I was like, I got to tell you, just far be it from me to do identity politics, but I can understand the mentality to some extent of both my grandmother as an example, who worked on the fucking Amtrak and Long Island Railroad system, who, and I'm not saying, I'm sure the gentleman from Virginia works a lot, but a guy who's driving an Uber from Egypt in New York City, it's I'm going to cut a lot more slack on the I'm offended that you're talking about people sitting on their ass rhetoric. Okay. So he called in, we cleared it up. It isn't even in the final legislation. I mean, come on, man. It's don't worry.
You're carrying water for them.
Yeah, it's okay.
It's concern trolling.
Yeah, I don't do that shit. Social justice warrior. The defense of Amy Klobuchar is pretty shocking. Abuse in the workplace is awful and all too shocking. Looking at past this is extremely sexist. I know people work for Hillary Clinton as well. Political views aside, I heard she was professional and one of the easiest bosses to work for in D.C. I've said this on multiple outlets now. I think the woke bros that came out today, I mentioned this, Bhaskar Sunkaras are Hillary Clinton, by all accounts, excellent to work for. And deploying that just unbelievably cynical and delusional defense of her is a disaster. It's a moral, political, historical disaster. And, as I keep saying, if she came out and said, I learned from this, my follow-up question would be, what's your view on the Green New Deal? I have no attachment to controversy mongering or canceling. But she came out and said, I have high expectations of my staff, just like myself and the country. What are you going to do? You going to fucking throw a binder at us? You going to like call foreign embassies and say we can't go on vacations because we pissed you off? I mean, it's ridiculous.
Hillary's such a good boss, she won't even make you go to Wisconsin.
She brings pizza to work.
Wait, does she? Oh, I see.
Now listen, you brocialists, I was making a serious point. Hillary Clinton is, by all accounts, an excellent boss.
I mean, look at the way that Peter Dowd went to the mat for her for like 18 months after that election.
Well,
he created Verret.
He's also completely he's reanimated.
I don't know if Dow is the
Dow's back from the
apparently
back from
Dow
the,
is
well, they all are. They're all incredibly
shit.
loyal to her. I mean, it must be.
He's not anymore though. That's what I'm
no?
saying. He's like rebirthed himself as like a Bernie bro.
It was like Verret crashed and he wasn't mentioned in the index of her book.
Oh,
he
yeah,
was
that's
like,
right.
You know what? Fucking drones and Wall Street. Hey, man, let's listen to some Pete Seeger.
Peter Dowd just becomes like the number one like anti Center for American Progress tweeter.
I'm all for it. And I mean, I'm all, again, I'm totally in the redemptive mode, so welcome aboard, Peter Dowd. But the comedic part of me is like, and because he's Peter Dow, he does all of the shit. Like, all of the things that he falsely accused other people of doing, he does. Where he's just like, she's a fucking bitch. And you're like, whoa, Peter, stop. That's not what it is. Happy Lulatine's Day, yes. Ryan in L.A., my favorite Elliot Abrams story is that at the height of the Iran-Contra treason, he claimed to have lost something like $20 million because he wrote down the wrong account number on a deposit slip for a Swiss bank account. So some third world dictator, a European Nazi supporting industrialist, or drug kingpin received a nice little bonus care of Uncle Ronnie Reagan. The Senate confirmed Barr. Jesus Christ. I guess that wasn't a surprise, but it's ridiculous. The candidate, Duncan Jr. defeated wasn't even Muslim. He was half Palestinian, half Latino Christian. But, you know, they're running anti-Muslim bigotry on it regardless. Let's see. All right. Again, not getting to all of these. Brian from Chicago. Happy Valentine's Day, MR crew. Have you seen the wealth tax calculator that Vox put out? Share my plan and created some interesting discussion. I want to know what you guys thought. I haven't seen it yet. The final IM of the day. Kamala Harris's Jamaican side. Actually, I'm still not for weed. We're back here tomorrow, everybody. Thanks.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the lie bar, but finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. I get somewhere the choice was made, for the option where you don't get paid, for the road that bends before it finally breaks you. I guess somehow I lost my drive,